Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Man at the Window. The first time Sophie Reed saw the man outside her house, she barely thought about him. It was a little after 11 on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after she had moved into number 14 Calder Street. She was standing at the kitchen sink with her sleeves pushed to her elbows, rinsing a wine glass beneath the tap, when she happened to glance through the window above it. A man was standing on the opposite pavement. He was perhaps 50, although the orange streetlight made it difficult to be certain. He wore a dark, waterproof jacket and ordinary trousers, and there was nothing particularly memorable about his face. He wasn't staring directly at Sophie's house. If anything, he seemed to be looking further along the street. She watched him for a few seconds. Then he took a phone from his pocket and looked at the screen. Someone waiting for a lift, Sophie decided. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. By morning, she had forgotten about him. That was one of the things Sophie liked about Calder Street. Nothing happened there. It was a short residential street of old terraced houses where recycling bins remained outside for days after collection, and neighbors apologized when their hedges grew across one another's fences. A narrow pedestrian lane at the far end led toward the railway station, so there were usually a few strangers passing through, particularly in the evenings. After 9 years living in flats, first with friends and then with her husband, the little house still felt slightly extravagant, despite the damp patch behind the washing machine and the bedroom window that refused to close properly unless Sophie pushed her shoulder against the frame. The separation had been remarkably undramatic. No affairs, no screaming arguments, no plates thrown against walls. She and Matthew had simply reached the unpleasant realization that they were much better at remembering who had bought milk than remembering why they had wanted to live together in the first place. He had kept the flat. Sophie had taken almost everything else she actually cared about. Her books, her mother's old coffee table, and a ridiculous ceramic duck Matthew had always hated. Calder Street was supposed to be temporary, 6 months, perhaps a year, long enough to work out what came next. The man appeared again on Friday. Sophie was sitting in the living room watching television when she noticed movement through a narrow gap in the curtains. Across the road, beneath the same streetlight, stood the same man. This time he wasn't looking at a phone. He simply stood with both hands in the pockets of his jacket. Sophie leaned slightly toward the window without touching the curtain. It could easily have been somebody else. She had seen the first man for seconds. Same height, perhaps. Same jacket. That meant nothing. She watched for perhaps a minute. Then the man turned and walked away. Not quickly. Not as though he had realized she was watching. He simply left. By Sunday, Sophie had forgotten about him again. On Monday, he returned. This time he stood 2 houses further down. Sophie noticed him while closing the living room curtains. Her hand stopped halfway. The man was facing the houses. She couldn't tell which one. She closed the curtains. Then, irritated with herself, she opened them again. He was still there. People were allowed to stand on pavements, she reminded herself. There were 20 houses on the street. She had no idea whether he was looking at hers. She went upstairs, brushed her teeth, and deliberately avoided the bedroom window. 20 minutes later, curiosity won. Sophie turned off the bedroom light before moving the curtain aside. The street light was empty. She slept normally. The following evening, at 11:17, he was back. Sophie stared at him from the kitchen. The man's head lifted. For the first time, there was no uncertainty about where he was looking. He was looking directly at her window. Sophie stepped backwards. The movement was instinctive and immediate, and she hated herself for it almost as soon as she'd done it. She waited perhaps 30 seconds before approaching the window again. The pavement was empty. At work the next morning, she mentioned it to a colleague. "Probably fancies you," Karen said. Sophie gave her a look. "Standing outside my house at 11 at night? All right, probably doesn't fancy you." "I'm serious." "So am I. Have you actually seen him doing anything?" "No." "Has he approached you?" "No." "Maybe he lives nearby." That was precisely the problem. Every explanation sounded reasonable when Sophie said it aloud. The following night she didn't see him, nor the night after. By Friday she had started to feel foolish. Then shortly before midnight, she heard the metal gate at the front of the house move. Sophie muted the television. The sound didn't repeat. She waited. Eventually, she crossed the living room and looked through the curtains. The man stood directly outside her gate. There was no phone in his hand. He wasn't pretending to wait for anyone. He was staring at the house. Sophie remained perfectly still. The man raised his eyes. Their gaze met through the glass. He didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't react at all. He simply looked at her. Sophie grabbed her phone from the sofa and opened the camera. By the time she returned to the window, he was walking away. She managed one photograph. It was blurred, but his face was visible. The next morning, Sophie saw the woman from number 12 sweeping leaves from her front step. Her name was Margaret. They had spoken twice since Sophie moved in, mostly about bin collections. "Can I ask you something strange?" Margaret rested both hands on the broom. "Go on." Sophie showed her the photograph. Margaret's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. "You know him?" "No." "But you've seen him." Margaret handed the phone back. "Where was he?" "Outside my gate." "When?" "Last night." Margaret looked toward number 14. Sophie waited. "What?" "I've seen him before." Something tightened in Sophie's stomach. "Recently." Margaret shook her head. "Before you moved in." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. "The woman who lived there before you," Margaret continued. "He used to stand across the road sometimes." Sophie looked at her house. "Did she know him?" "I don't know. She wasn't particularly sociable." "What was her name?" "Laura. Laura Bennett, I think." "Why did she leave?" Margaret hesitated. "She just went." "What does that mean?" "1 week she was there. Next week she wasn't. A van came for her things afterwards." Sophie glanced again at the photograph. "Did she ever say anything about him?" "Not to me." Margaret looked uncomfortable now. "There was one night the police came." "When?" "A month or 2 before she left. I don't know what happened. I didn't ask." Sophie thanked her and went inside. For the first time since moving in, number 14 no longer felt entirely like her house. She walked through the rooms slowly. There were marks she'd never paid attention to before. 2 small filled holes beside the bedroom window. Scratches around the back door lock beneath a layer of white paint. A rectangular patch inside the hallway where the wall was a slightly different shade. All perfectly ordinary remnants of previous occupants. Yesterday she wouldn't have noticed any of them. Now each seemed capable of having a history. Sophie emailed the letting agency. The reply came that afternoon. They couldn't disclose personal information about previous tenants, but they assured her that all locks had been changed before her tenancy began. It wasn't the answer she'd asked for. That evening, she kept the curtains closed. At 10:45, she checked the front door. At 10:50, she checked it again. By 11, she was annoyed with herself. This was exactly how fear worked, she thought. It took ordinary things and promoted them. A noise became a footstep. A stranger became a threat. Scratches in old paint became evidence. At 11:23, Sophie looked through the smallest possible gap in the curtains. Nobody was there. She felt relieved. Then she noticed the folded piece of paper on the floor beneath the letterbox. Sophie stared at it. She had been downstairs for almost an hour. She hadn't heard the letterbox open. She picked the paper up. 3 words had been written in block capitals. "Where is it?" Sophie read them twice. Then she opened the front door. The street was empty. She called the police. 2 officers arrived 40 minutes later. They were polite and took her seriously, which somehow made the situation feel worse. Sophie showed them the photograph and explained what Margaret had told her. One officer photographed the note. "Do you know what this refers to?" he asked. "No." "Nothing left in the property when you moved in?" "Some rubbish under the sink. That's about it." "Have you had contact with the previous tenant?" "I don't even know her." The officers searched the small garden and alleyway beside the terrace. Nothing had been disturbed. They advised Sophie to keep the doors and windows locked, document further sightings, and call immediately if the man returned or attempted to enter the property. It was sensible advice. It also meant that for now, there was very little anyone could do. Sophie slept with the hallway light on. The man didn't appear for 4 days. By the 5th, Sophie had installed a video doorbell and a small camera overlooking the back garden. Matthew had offered to stay over, but she refused. "You don't have to prove anything," he told her over the phone. "I'm not proving anything." "Then why won't you let me come?" "Because if I leave this house or have someone babysit me every time some idiot stands outside, then I'm never going to feel comfortable here again." There was a pause. "Call me if anything happens." "I will." Sophie appreciated that he didn't argue. The next sighting happened on Wednesday afternoon. That frightened her more than any of the others. She was coming home from work shortly after 5 when she saw him beside the pedestrian lane at the end of Calder Street. Daylight changed him. He looked older than Sophie had thought, mid-50s perhaps, thinning gray hair, clean-shaven, the sort of face she might have passed in a supermarket without remembering. He was holding a carrier bag. For one absurd moment, the ordinariness of it reassured her. Then he saw her. He stopped walking. Sophie stopped too. 20 meters separated them. Cars moved along the main road behind her. Somewhere nearby, a child was laughing. Sophie took out her phone. The man turned into the pedestrian lane. She didn't follow. That night, she checked the doorbell recordings. He had visited the house at 2:14 that afternoon. The footage showed him walking through the gate and approaching the front door. He didn't knock. He leaned toward the camera, examining it. Then he looked through the living room window. For almost 20 seconds, he stood completely still. Finally, he walked away. Sophie sent the recording to the police. The following morning, she received another note. It had been pushed beneath the garden gate rather than through the letterbox, presumably to avoid the camera. She left it there. Sophie stood in the hallway reading the sentence. This time she understood one thing. The notes weren't about her. They were about Laura Bennett. Sophie spent that evening searching the house. She began carefully, opening cupboards and checking drawers. Within an hour, she was moving furniture. There was nothing beneath the bed, nothing behind the wardrobe, nothing taped underneath drawers or concealed behind bookshelves. She searched the kitchen last. The units were old and cheaply fitted, with narrow kickboards running along the floor beneath them. Sophie noticed one section wasn't quite flush with the others. She crouched and pulled. The panel came loose. Behind it was dust, a dried pea, 2 bottle caps, and an empty space extending beneath the cupboards. Sophie shone her phone torch inside. Something reflected the light. Her heartbeat changed. She reached into the darkness. Her fingers touched plastic. Sophie pulled out a small transparent freezer bag. Inside was a USB drive. For several seconds, she remained crouched on the kitchen floor. Then she heard footsteps outside. Sophie switched off the phone torch. The footsteps stopped. She slowly stood. Through the darkened kitchen window, she could see the street beyond the back garden, but not the front pavement. Her phone vibrated in her hand. A notification from the doorbell camera. Motion detected. Sophie opened the live feed. The man stood outside the gate. He was looking directly into the camera. Sophie backed away from the window. The man remained there for almost a minute. Then he left. She didn't plug the USB drive into her laptop. Instead, she placed it on the kitchen table and called the police. While she waited, she phoned Matthew. "I found something." "What?" "I don't know yet. A USB drive. It was hidden under the kitchen units." "Don't touch anything else." "I've already touched it." "You know what I mean." Sophie walked into the living room. What if this is what he wants? Then give it to the police. "I am." "Good." Sophie approached the curtain. "And stop looking out the bloody window." Despite herself, she smiled. "I wasn't." "You absolutely were." The police collected the drive that night. For the first time in weeks, Sophie felt that something concrete had happened. There was an object, evidence, something that might explain why a stranger had been watching her home. 2 days later, an officer called. The drive contained photographs, scanned documents, and audio recordings. They couldn't tell Sophie everything while inquiries were ongoing, but they confirmed that some of the material appeared to relate to a man named Peter Vance. Sophie recognized the name from nowhere. "Is that him?" "We believe so." "What did Laura have on him?" The officer paused. Some of the material appears to concern another woman. What does that mean? A former colleague of Mr. Vance. She disappeared 3 years ago. Sophie sat down. Disappeared? Her whereabouts are still unknown. And Laura? We're trying to locate her. You don't know where she is? We've made contact with someone we believe is a relative. That's all I can tell you at the moment. After the call, Sophie remained at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was silent around her. She imagined Laura sitting in the same chair, Laura removing the kickboard, Laura pushing the little plastic bag into the darkness. Why hide it rather than take it with her? Perhaps she'd intended to return. Perhaps she had been frightened somebody would search her belongings. Perhaps she'd simply run out of time. That evening, Sophie noticed something strange. The man wasn't outside. She checked at 11. Then midnight. Nothing. The following night was the same. By Saturday, his absence had begun to feel like an answer. The police had the drive. Whatever Peter Vance had wanted was no longer inside number 14. It was over. On Sunday morning, Sophie opened every curtain in the house. She cleaned the kitchen, put music on, and spent 20 minutes trying to force the loose kickboard properly back into place. At lunchtime, Margaret knocked on the door with a parcel that had been delivered to her house by mistake. You look better, Margaret said. I feel better. Has he gone? Seems like it. Sophie considered telling her about the USB drive, but decided against it. That evening, she spoke to Matthew, cooked dinner, and watched half a film before falling asleep on the sofa. She woke at 1:07 a.m. The television had returned to its menu screen. For a few seconds, Sophie didn't know what had woken her. Then she heard the sound, a faint metallic scrape. From the kitchen. Sophie sat upright. Nothing followed. She reached for her phone. The back door camera showed the garden empty. The doorbell camera showed the front step. Empty. Sophie listened. Another scrape. Closer. She stood. The kitchen light was off, but the glow from the television reached the doorway. Sophie took 2 steps toward it. A thin line of cold air touched her face. The back door was open, only a few centimeters, but open. Sophie stopped breathing. She knew she'd locked it. She had checked it before going to sleep. Her phone was already in her hand. She backed toward the stairs and dialed 999. The operator answered. Sophie kept her voice low. Someone's in my house. As she spoke, she looked toward the living room window. For weeks, that window had been the place she looked whenever she was afraid. The place where he stood. The pavement beyond it was empty. And Sophie finally understood why that frightened her more than seeing him there ever had. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Sophie ran. She didn't think about shoes or keys. She pulled the front door open and sprinted into the street, still speaking to the emergency operator. Behind her, something moved inside the house. Sophie ran to number 12 and hammered on Margaret's door. Lights came on upstairs. Then Sophie heard her own front door open. She turned. Peter Vance stepped onto the pavement. He didn't run toward her. He simply stood in the doorway. For the first time, there was no glass between them, no road, no uncertainty about who he was looking at. He looked at Sophie, then at the phone against her ear, and walked away. He's leaving, Sophie told the operator. He's walking toward the lane. Do not follow him. I won't. Peter reached the end of the street. A police car turned into Calder Street. He ran. That was the first time Sophie had ever seen him hurry. He made it halfway through the pedestrian lane before officers caught him. The search of number 14 found a screwdriver beside the back door and a pair of gloves in the upstairs hallway. More importantly, officers found scratches around the kitchen kickboard. Peter had been searching for the drive. He had apparently watched Sophie remove it several nights earlier. The police later established that he had been entering the back garden through neighboring properties, keeping himself outside the range of Sophie's camera before approaching along the narrow strip directly beneath the kitchen window. He had watched her search. He had seen her find something, and he had known. The message Sophie found the following morning had not been there when the police first searched the property after his arrest. It was discovered beneath a flower pot near the back gate, protected from the rain inside a clear plastic sleeve. 2 words. You found it. Peter Vance was charged with offenses relating to Sophie and with the earlier stalking of Laura Bennett. The contents of the USB drive reopened the investigation into the disappearance of his former colleague, a woman named Claire Morrison. Months later, Sophie learned what Laura had done. Laura and Claire had worked together. After Claire disappeared, Laura had become convinced that Peter knew more than he admitted. She began collecting anything she could find: copies of messages Claire had sent her, photographs of Peter waiting outside their workplace, audio recordings of conversations and notes documenting the occasions when he followed her home. Then Peter realized what Laura was doing. He began appearing outside number 14, exactly as he later would for Sophie. Laura went to the police, but much of what she had gathered was circumstantial. She became increasingly frightened and eventually left Calder Street with almost no warning. She hid the drive because she believed Peter had searched her car once already. She intended to retrieve it after moving. She never did. Not because Peter killed her, not because she vanished. The truth was much more ordinary. Laura had been so frightened that once she reached her sister's house 200 miles away, she couldn't make herself go back. She changed her number, found another job, and tried to forget about number 14. The drive remained beneath the kitchen cupboard, and Peter kept returning, waiting for Laura, waiting for somebody who knew where she'd gone. Then Sophie moved in. At first, Peter hadn't known whether Sophie was connected to Laura. So he watched. He watched long enough to learn when Sophie came home, which lights she switched on, when she went upstairs, whether anyone stayed overnight. And eventually he convinced himself that Laura must have told her something. The police found notebooks in Peter's home, pages of dates and times, descriptions of Sophie leaving for work, returning with shopping, speaking to Margaret, taking rubbish outside. One entry was only 4 words long. She doesn't know yet. Another, written 2 weeks later, read, "She is looking now." Peter had mistaken Sophie's growing fear for knowledge. His own behavior had caused her to search the house. And by trying to recover the evidence Laura had hidden, he had led Sophie directly to it. 6 months after Peter's arrest, Sophie moved out of Calder Street. She told people it was because the tenancy was ending. That was partly true. The real reason was that she never completely recovered the feeling she'd had that final night when she looked through the window and saw an empty pavement. She moved into a second-floor flat on the other side of town. There was a secure entrance downstairs, cameras in the communal hallway, and no garden gate for anyone to stand beside. For the first few weeks, Sophie kept the curtains closed after dark. Eventually, she stopped. Peter Vance was in custody, awaiting trial. Laura Bennett had given a formal statement. The investigation into Claire Morrison's disappearance was continuing. There was no reason to keep looking outside. One rainy evening in November, Sophie arrived home shortly after 9. She made dinner, spoke briefly to Matthew, and sat beside the window with a book. Half an hour later, she realized she'd read the same page 3 times. Someone was standing across the road. Sophie looked up. A man waited beneath the awning of a closed shop. Dark jacket, hands in his pockets. Her body reacted before her mind did. Then a bus pulled in. The man checked his phone, stepped from beneath the awning, and climbed aboard. The bus drove away. Sophie remained beside the window. After a while, she laughed quietly at herself. She closed the book and went to make tea. Before leaving the room, she looked outside once more. The pavement was empty. This time she let it be empty. But for the rest of her life, whenever Sophie passed a lit window after dark, she found herself wondering how much could be learned about the person on the other side simply by standing still and watching. What time they came home, which room they slept in, whether they lived alone, how often they checked the lock, and how long it would take them to notice that the same man had been standing across the road every night. Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Voice Downstairs. Claire Morgan had spent almost 2 years telling Robbie that the next house would be better. The flat they moved into after her separation had never been intended to last. It was too small, too warm in summer, too cold in winter, and every sound from the neighbors seemed to pass directly through the walls. Robbie had learned to do homework at the kitchen table, while Claire worked on her laptop beside him. And Claire had learned to ignore the man upstairs who seemed to move furniture at midnight. So when she finally found the little semi-detached house on Hawthorne Crescent, she signed the tenancy before somebody else could. It wasn't remarkable. The carpets were older than she would have chosen, the kitchen cupboards had been painted badly, and the narrow hallway somehow made the house look smaller from inside than it did from the street. Robbie loved it. At 10 years old, having his own proper bedroom apparently outweighed every other consideration. This room is massive. Claire stood in the doorway surrounded by half-open boxes. It's not massive. I could fit a sofa in here. You are not getting a sofa. A little one. No. Robbie looked thoughtfully toward an empty corner. Beanbag. We'll negotiate. That was how most conversations between them worked. Robbie attempted to turn everything into a negotiation, and Claire pretended she wasn't usually going to give in anyway. His father, Mark, lived 20 minutes away and saw Robbie most weekends. The separation had been difficult, but not disastrous. Claire and Mark had reached the point where they could speak without reopening old arguments, and Robbie had adapted better than either of them had expected. The house felt like the first thing that belonged entirely to Claire and Robbie. For the first week, nothing happened. The cupboard beneath the stairs began opening during the second. Claire noticed it one morning while getting ready for work. Robbie. He appeared at the top of the stairs with his school jumper half on. What? Can you stop leaving this open? What open? The cupboard. I didn't. Claire closed it. Well, someone did. Robbie looked toward the front door. Maybe a burglar. Yes, a burglar broke in, ignored the television, and opened the Hoover cupboard. Could be checking what Hoover we've got. Go brush your teeth. That evening, the cupboard was open again. Claire blamed the catch. The next small incident involved Robbie's water bottle. He couldn't find it before school. Claire searched the kitchen. Robbie checked his bedroom twice. They argued mildly about whether he had left it at football training, and he eventually went to school with an old plastic bottle from the back of a cupboard. The following morning, his missing bottle stood upright in the center of the kitchen table. Claire assumed Robbie had found it. Robbie assumed Claire had. Neither mentioned it again. A few nights later, Claire was working downstairs after Robbie had gone to bed when she heard footsteps crossing the landing above her. She stopped typing. There were 3 slow creaks from the ceiling. Then another. Robbie, she called. You're supposed to be asleep. Nothing. Claire waited. Robbie. No answer. She went upstairs. His bedroom door was partly open. Robbie was asleep on his side facing the wall, one hand beneath his pillow. Claire stood there for a few seconds before quietly closing the door. Old house, she thought. Old floorboards, heating pipes. There was always an explanation once you looked for one. Robbie was the first to become uneasy. It happened shortly after midnight on a Thursday. He woke needing water and walked downstairs without switching on the hallway light. Claire had left a small lamp on in the living room, enough to throw a weak rectangle of light across the bottom of the stairs. Robbie reached the hallway and stopped. The kitchen door was moving. It wasn't swinging. It was slowly closing. He watched the dark gap narrow until the latch clicked into place. Robbie remained still. The kitchen was on the opposite side of the house from any open window. He told himself Claire had left it nearly closed, and a draft had done the rest. Then something tapped once against the other side of the door. Robbie went upstairs without getting water. The next morning he almost told Claire. Instead, he asked whether she'd been downstairs during the night. No, why? Nothing. Claire looked at him. Robbie, I just heard something. This house makes about 40 different noises every time the heating comes on. Yeah, probably that. It was easier to agree. The voices began so subtly that neither of them recognized them as part of the same thing. Claire was upstairs folding laundry one Saturday afternoon when she heard Robbie call from downstairs. Mom? She kept matching socks. What? No reply. Robbie? Silence. Claire carried the basket downstairs. Robbie was sitting in the living room wearing headphones, completely absorbed in a game. Did you call me? He removed one side of the headset. What? Never mind. The following week, Robbie heard Claire say his name while he was doing homework. Yeah? Nobody answered. He went into the hallway. The bathroom door was closed and the shower was running upstairs. Robbie stood there, listening. His mother's voice hadn't sounded strange. That was the unsettling part. He had heard it clearly. Robbie. Exactly the way she always said it when she wanted his attention. He didn't mention it. A few days later, Claire was in the living room when she heard Robbie laughing upstairs. Not loudly, just the short burst of laughter he made when watching something on his phone. She smiled without thinking. Then movement outside caught her eye. Robbie was in the back garden kicking a football against the fence. Claire looked at the ceiling. The house was silent. That evening, she asked him whether he'd left a video playing upstairs. No? Tablet? No. You sure? Robbie gave her the suspicious look children reserve for adults asking obviously pointless questions. Yeah. Claire let it go. But that night she checked the cupboard beneath the stairs before going to bed. It was closed. At 3 a.m, she woke because something fell downstairs. The crash was loud enough to make her sit upright. Claire switched on the bedside lamp and listened. Nothing followed. She walked onto the landing. Robbie's door remained closed. Claire went downstairs. A framed photograph that usually stood on a shelf beside the television lay face down on the carpet. The shelf itself was stable. Nothing else had moved. Claire picked the photograph up. It was one of Robbie at 7 years old, missing one front tooth and grinning beside his father at the beach. She returned it to the shelf. As she turned, the cupboard beneath the stairs creaked open. Claire stared at it. The door moved perhaps 3 inches and stopped. She crossed the hallway and pushed it closed firmly. The next morning, she bought a new magnetic catch. For 3 days, the cupboard stayed shut. Then Robbie came home from school before Claire on a wet Monday afternoon. He dumped his bag beside the stairs and went to the kitchen. The house was quiet. He was halfway through making toast when he heard 3 knocks. Robbie stopped. 3 slow taps. From the hallway. He looked through the kitchen doorway. Nothing. Another 3 knocks. This time he knew where they came from. The cupboard. Robbie didn't move. His toast popped up behind him and made him flinch. Then from inside the cupboard, his mother said, "Robbie?" He stared at the door. The voice was muffled slightly by the wood. "Robbie?" His hand moved automatically toward his pocket. He took out his phone. Before he could unlock it, the screen lit up. Mum calling. Robbie answered immediately. "Hello? Hey, I'm leaving now. Do you want me to pick anything up?" Robbie looked at the cupboard. "No. You all right?" "Yeah." There was another quiet knock from beneath the stairs. Robbie stepped backwards. "Actually, can you come home?" Claire heard something in his voice. "I'm already on my way. What's happened?" "Nothing. Just come home." Robbie waited in the front garden until her car arrived. He told her about the knocking. He did not tell her about the voice. Not yet. Claire opened the cupboard herself. Coats, Hoover, toolbox, nothing else. She crouched and checked the back wall for any gaps. Mouse, maybe. It didn't sound like a mouse. What did it sound like? Robbie hesitated. Knocking. Claire studied his face. You can tell me if something scared you. I know. But he still said nothing about hearing her voice. That evening, Claire began noticing how much the house had changed without actually changing at all. The hallway seemed darker than she remembered. She caught herself looking toward the cupboard whenever she passed it. Every creak from upstairs made her stop and listen. 2 nights later, Robbie was already asleep when Claire went into the bathroom to brush her teeth. As she stood at the sink, she heard voices from his room. Robbie's first. No. Claire paused. A few seconds passed. Robbie spoke again. I don't know. Claire put down her toothbrush. There was another pause, and then, Mum said I'm not allowed. Claire crossed the landing and opened his bedroom door. Robbie was lying in bed reading. He looked up. What? Who are you talking to? No one. I just heard you. Robbie frowned. I wasn't talking. Claire looked around the room. His phone was charging on the desk. You haven't been on a call? No. Claire walked back onto the landing. Robbie sat up. Mum? She turned. He looked nervous now. I heard you the other day. Heard me what? Calling me. Claire didn't answer immediately. When? When you were in the shower. She felt something cold settle behind her ribs. Why didn't you tell me? Because I thought I'd imagined it. Robbie hesitated. And yesterday, in the cupboard, Claire's face changed. What about the cupboard? It sounded like you. Neither spoke for several seconds. Claire sat beside him. Exactly like me? Robbie nodded. Then my phone rang, and you were at work. Claire wanted to offer him a sensible explanation. She couldn't find one. That night, Robbie slept in her room. Claire barely slept at all. Shortly after 2, she heard something move downstairs. A scrape, then a soft click. She remained still. From the hallway below came her own voice. Robbie, come downstairs. Claire's entire body tightened. The voice was hers. Not approximately hers. Hers. She looked at Robbie sleeping beside her. The voice came again. Robbie! Claire reached across and locked the bedroom door. Nothing else happened. By morning, daylight had made the memory feel less possible. Claire considered calling the police, then imagined herself explaining that somebody in an empty hallway had spoken using her voice. Instead, she phoned Mark. She didn't tell him everything, just that Robbie had been unsettled by noises, and she wanted him to stay there over the weekend. Robbie objected. I'm not leaving you here. I am 36, Robbie. You're scared too. Claire looked at him. Children occasionally said things with a directness adults spent years learning to avoid. I'm not staying here alone either, she admitted. They agreed to spend the weekend with Claire's sister, but before they left, the staircase happened. It was Friday night. They had decided to go in the morning. Claire had packed 2 bags and left them beside the front door. At 11:30, she went to bed. Robbie stayed awake reading. The house settled around them. At 12:14, Robbie heard his mother call from downstairs. Robbie? He looked toward his bedroom door. There was nothing unusual in her voice. Mom? Come down here a second. Robbie put his book aside. He assumed she'd forgotten something while packing. He opened his bedroom door. The upstairs landing was dark except for the weak blue glow of a nightlight outside the bathroom. What is it? From downstairs. Just come here. Robbie walked toward the staircase. The stairs turned halfway down, and from the upper section he could see only the wall and part of the hallway ceiling below. He descended slowly. Mom? No answer. He reached the bend. Then Claire's voice came from beneath him. Robbie. Closer now, directly below. Robbie put one hand on the banister. He took another step. Behind him upstairs, a door opened. Robbie? He stopped. For a moment his mind refused to arrange what he had heard. Then his real mother spoke from the landing. What are you doing? Robbie turned. Claire stood outside her bedroom in a dressing gown, hair loose around her shoulders. His face emptied. Claire saw it immediately. What? Robbie stared at her. You called me. No, I didn't. From downstairs, Claire's voice said, Robbie? Neither of them moved. Claire's eyes shifted toward the darkness below him. Robbie gripped the banister. The voice came again, perfectly calm. Come here. Claire crossed the landing. Robbie, come back up. He moved, and at first slowly. Then whatever paralysis had held him broke, and he ran up the remaining stairs. Claire pulled him toward her. They backed into her bedroom and locked the door. For almost a minute, nothing happened. Then someone walked along the hallway downstairs. One step, another. They stopped beneath the bedroom. Claire called the police. 2 officers searched the entire house. Windows locked. Doors intact. No sign anyone had entered. The cupboard beneath the stairs was empty. Claire and Robbie left before sunrise. They stayed with Claire's sister Helen for 3 nights. Nothing happened, no voices, no moving objects, no footsteps. Claire arranged to end the tenancy. She had no interest in understanding the house. She only wanted them out. On Tuesday afternoon, they returned to collect clothes, paperwork, and Claire's work equipment. Helen came with them and stayed until early evening. The house seemed absurdly ordinary in daylight. Claire began wondering whether exhaustion and fear had somehow distorted what they had experienced. Then Helen left. Claire intended to stay only another hour. Robbie remained upstairs packing books. Claire stood in the hallway. "If I call you, don't just come running." Robbie looked down from the landing. "What?" "If either of us hears the other from somewhere we can't see, we find each other first." Robbie nodded. "We need a password." Despite everything, Claire almost smiled. "A password? So we know it's actually us." "Fine, pick one," Robbie thought. "Purple penguin." "Seriously?" "You said pick one." "Purple penguin." They repeated it once. That was all. 20 minutes later, Claire was in the kitchen when she heard Robbie behind the closed door. "Mom?" She stopped packing. The voice came again. "It's me." Claire stared at the door. Then, "Purple penguin." Every hair along her arms rose. She took out her phone and called Robbie. His ringtone began upstairs. The voice behind the kitchen door stopped. Robbie answered. "Mom, lock your bedroom door." "What?" "Now." Claire heard him move. Then from upstairs her own voice shouted, "Robbie, open the door!" Robbie gasped through the phone. Claire ran into the hallway and the lights went out. Something slammed upstairs, then another door. The cupboard beneath the stairs flew open hard enough to strike the wall. Claire switched on her phone torch. "Robbie!" She stopped herself. No calling, no trusting voices. She ran upstairs. From the living room behind her came Robbie's voice. "Mom, help me." Claire kept climbing. "Mom!" It sounded terrified. Crying, exactly like him. She reached Robbie's bedroom and hammered on the door. "It's me." "Password." Claire almost laughed from sheer panic. "Purple penguin." The door opened. Robbie grabbed her. Downstairs, Robbie's voice screamed, "Mom!" Claire shut the bedroom door. For several seconds they stood together. The house seemed to move around them. Drawers opened. Something crashed in the kitchen. Footsteps ran up the stairs and stopped outside the room. Then Claire's voice spoke from the other side of the door. "Robbie, open this." He looked at her. Claire held one finger against her lips. Her voice outside changed. "Purple penguin." Robbie began to cry silently. The handle moved. Claire pushed the desk against the door. "We're leaving." "How?" "Together." They waited until the handle stopped moving. Then Claire pulled the desk aside. She opened the door. Empty landing. She took Robbie's hand. Neither let go. They moved toward the stairs. Halfway down, something began knocking from inside the cupboard. 3 slow knocks. Then Claire's voice whispered from within it. "Robbie?" Claire kept walking. The front door was 10 feet away. Behind them, from upstairs, Robbie began screaming. Not speaking. Screaming. Claire felt Robbie's hand tighten around hers. They reached the door. The lock wouldn't turn. Claire pulled harder. Behind them, footsteps descended the stairs. One at a time, Robbie began saying, "Mom," under his breath. "I know." The lock turned. Claire opened the door. As they stepped outside, her own voice spoke from the darkness behind them. "Don't leave me." Claire pulled Robbie into the street. They ran to the car without looking back. Helen's house felt different after that. Safe, but only because Claire and Robbie needed to believe somewhere could be. They slept in separate rooms again after a week. After 2 weeks, Robbie stopped asking whether Claire had heard anything during the night. The tenancy on Hawthorne Crescent ended. Claire never returned. A removal company collected the furniture during daylight. Nothing unusual happened. For nearly a month, there were no voices. Then, shortly after midnight on a Sunday, Claire woke in Helen's spare bedroom. Someone was calling from upstairs. "Mom?" Claire opened her eyes. Robbie was staying in the bedroom directly above her. "Mom?" She sat up. The voice sounded frightened. Claire reached for the lamp. Before she could switch it on, the bedroom door opened. Robbie stepped inside. He was pale. "Did you hear that?" Claire looked toward the ceiling. From the empty bedroom upstairs came Robbie's voice. "Mom?" Claire got out of bed. Robbie moved beside her. Neither answered. Above them, something crossed the floor. Slowly, then stopped directly over their heads. For several seconds there was silence, and then from upstairs Claire's own voice said, "Robbie, come here." Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Empty Ship. By the autumn of 1898, Thomas Avery had spent nearly half his life at sea and had learned that most frightening things became less frightening once a man understood what caused them. A strange light on the horizon usually belonged to another vessel. A knocking beneath the deck was generally timber working against iron. A voice heard during a night watch could be carried by wind from farther across the water than seemed possible. Sailors in Avery's experience were particularly skilled at turning ignorance into superstition. It was why when Ned Collins called down from the lookout shortly after midday and said there was a ship to the northwest that did not appear to be moving, Avery reached first for his telescope rather than his imagination. The SS Meridian was 11 days out from Liverpool and bound for Halifax with machinery, textiles, and enough general freight packed into her holds to make Captain Edwin Harrow complain about the loading clerk every time the ship rolled heavily. She was not a beautiful vessel, but she was dependable. Her iron hull had survived worse seas than the gray Atlantic currently rolling beneath them, and the engines had behaved themselves for most of the crossing. Avery climbed to the bridge and took the glass from Collins. "Where?" Collins pointed. "Just off the mist there." The weather had been strangely mild since morning. The wind was weak and the sea had settled into long, dark swells that lifted the Meridian gently before lowering her again. Thin strips of fog lay along the horizon like smoke. Avery found the vessel. She sat several miles away, broadside to them. "Steamer?" Captain Harrow asked. "Aye." "Making way?" "Not that I can see." Harrow took the telescope. Avery watched his expression. The captain was 56. Broad across the shoulders and almost completely bald, except for a stubborn ring of white hair above his ears. 27 years at sea had given him the habit of considering every decision several seconds longer than seemed necessary. "Signal her." The Meridian changed course. As they drew closer, more men gathered at the rail. The unknown vessel was a cargo steamer similar in size to their own. Her hull sat correctly in the water. No smoke rose from the funnel, but there was no visible damage either. Her masts were intact, and nothing suggested collision or fire. Daniel Mercer leaned over the rail beside his older brother. "Maybe they've all gone for lunch." Jacob Mercer snorted. "Whole ship? Good lunch." Jacob shoved his shoulder. Daniel was 20 and on only his second Atlantic crossing. His brother, 7 years older, had been at sea since 16 and treated Daniel's presence aboard the Meridian as both a source of pride and an ongoing inconvenience. The signal flag went unanswered. Harrow ordered, the whistle sounded. The deep blast rolled across the water. Nothing moved on the other ship. Samuel Price, the Meridian's carpenter, joined Avery at the rail. "Could be engine trouble." "Then they have eyes," Avery said. Price scratched his beard. "Unless they're all below." Behind them, Elias Rourke said, "20 men below at once?" Price looked back. Rourke was the oldest working sailor aboard the Meridian and looked older than his 52 years. Wind and salt had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his beard had gone almost entirely gray. "You've an explanation, Elias?" Price asked. "Not one you'll enjoy." "I rarely do." Rourke watched the silent vessel. "A ship without a man on deck isn't inviting you aboard." Price smiled. "Ships don't invite anyone anywhere." "No," Rourke said. "Exactly." By 3 o'clock, the vessels were less than half a mile apart. The name painted across the other ship's stern became visible. Bellwether. Captain Harrow searched his shipping records but found nothing useful beyond the name of a British merchant vessel registered out of Bristol. No distress signal had been raised. No boat approached them. There was no movement anywhere on deck. Harrow lowered his telescope. "We'll send a party." Rourke muttered something under his breath. Harrow ignored him. "Avery, you lead. Take Price." Price nodded. "Mercer." Both brothers looked up. Harrow pointed at Daniel. "The young one." Jacob grinned. Daniel tried not to look pleased. And Rourke. Rourke stared at the captain. Sir. Problem? Not if you're ordering me. I am. Then no problem. A boat was prepared. Before Daniel climbed down, Jacob caught his sleeve. If you find gold, I get half. If I find gold, I'm retiring before you see me again. You owe me 8 shillings. I'll post it. Jacob laughed. It was the last time Daniel ever saw his brother smiling. The crossing took less than 10 minutes. As they approached the bellwether, Avery searched the rail for movement. There was none. The hull rose beside them, black and wet. A boarding ladder hung down one side. That bothered Avery. Someone had lowered it. He climbed first. The deck above was empty. Price followed, then Daniel, with Rourke last. Avery called out, "Bellwether!" His voice traveled across the open deck and disappeared into the sea. No answer. They waited. The silence of a large ship was unlike silence anywhere else. A house could be empty. A church could be empty. But a working vessel had a pulse even when men slept. Rope moved. Boots struck timber. Engines breathed through metal. Someone coughed, shouted, cursed, or dropped something. The bellwether seemed to contain none of it. Price crossed toward the forward hatch. Cargo hatch open. Avery joined him. The hatch had been left partly raised. A coil of rope lay beside it, half secured. Price crouched. Someone stopped halfway through. Could have been ordered off deck. For what? Avery looked around. That's what we're here to learn. They searched the upper deck first. No bodies, no blood, no indication of violence. One bucket had rolled against the rail and rested there. A pair of work gloves sat beside a winch. At the stern, Daniel looked down. Boats are here. Avery turned. Every lifeboat remained secured. Rourke looked at him. There's your first answer. To what? They didn't abandon her. They entered through the main companionway. The air inside was cool and stale. The galley held the first sign that people had been aboard recently. 4 bowls stood on a table. One contained the dried remains of stew. A mug lay on its side. Price lifted a loaf of bread and pressed his thumb into it. Not fresh. How long? Avery asked. Several days, maybe less. Daniel opened a cupboard. Food's still here. Avery looked through the doorway toward the passage. No shouting, no footsteps, nothing. The officers' quarters were equally strange. Clothes remained in drawers. A pair of spectacles rested on an open book beside one bunk. Another bed was unmade, the blanket hanging almost to the floor. Daniel picked up a pipe from a small table. Wouldn't leave this. Rourke said, Depends why you're leaving. They checked the engine room. Price spent nearly 15 minutes inspecting machinery. The boilers were cold. There had been no explosion, no catastrophic failure, no flooding. He came back wiping his hands. Nothing here would have made them take to the boats. The boats are still aboard, Daniel said. Price looked at him. Exactly. Avery's unease deepened not because they had found something frightening, but because they had found nothing. Every sensible explanation required evidence that wasn't there. Disease should have left sick men or bodies. Piracy should have left damage. Evacuation should have required boats. Rescue by another vessel might explain the missing crew, but not why they had apparently walked away from food, clothing, cargo, and personal belongings without leaving any obvious record. They reached the captain's cabin near the end of the hour. The logbook lay on the desk. Avery opened it. The first pages he checked were ordinary. Position, weather, coal consumption, a repair to a steam line, one crewman recovering from fever. Then, 6 days earlier, sighted unidentified vessel northwest. No response to signal. Avery read the next entry aloud. Vessel apparently abandoned. Captain ordered boat lowered. Second officer Hale and 3 men sent aboard. Daniel looked up. 4. Avery glanced at him. What? 4 men went across. Price shrugged. So? Nothing. The next entry, boarding party returned shortly before dusk. No persons found aboard. Vessel appeared seaworthy. Rourke moved closer. Avery turned the page. 4 men returned from the vessel. Hale reports nothing of value concerning her crew. Rourke tapped the line with one finger. There, Price sighed. What now? Why write that? Because 4 went. And 4 came back. Yes? Rourke held his gaze. Then why does it need saying? Price looked toward Avery as if asking permission to dismiss him. Avery kept reading. The following entry mentions Second Officer Hale insisting that the abandoned vessel should be left behind. Another recorded complaints of sounds from empty compartments below deck. Then, unable to account for Cooper and Finch at morning muster. Search made throughout ship. Daniel stopped smiling. Avery turned the page. 3 additional men absent, boats secured, no sign of disturbance. The handwriting changed after that. It became smaller, less controlled. The final completed entry contained only 1 sentence. We have sighted another vessel. Nobody spoke. Price eventually said, could have been illness. Rourke laughed once without humor. Illness that removes 5 men and leaves their boots? Men panic. Into the sea? Maybe. 5? Avery closed the book. We're taking this back. Daniel looked toward the cabin window. We've been longer than an hour. Avery checked his watch. Nearly 2. They returned to the deck. The meridian was still visible across the water. For a moment that reassured Avery. Then Daniel waved. No one waved back. Avery walked to the rail. The deck of the meridian looked empty. Ned! He shouted. Nothing. Price cupped both hands around his mouth. Meridian. Silence. Rourke stared across at the ship. Daniel said, Jacob will be below. Avery didn't answer. They lowered themselves into the boat. The row back seemed longer. As they approached the meridian, Daniel repeatedly called his brother's name. No face appeared above them. No rope was thrown down. They had to catch the ladder themselves. Daniel climbed first. Jacob! Avery followed. The deck was empty. Captain! Nothing. Price headed toward the bridge. Rourke remained beside Avery. I don't like this. Neither did Avery. Daniel disappeared through the crew passage. Jacob! Avery entered the galley. A pot simmered on the stove. Steam rose gently from beneath the lid. A loaf of bread sat on the table. Half of it had been sliced. The knife lay beside it. Arthur Bell was nowhere to be seen. Avery touched the pot handle. Hot. They had not been gone long enough for this to be anything but recent. Price returned from the bridge. Nobody. Captain's cabin? Empty. Avery walked there himself. Captain Harrow's glasses rested beside the open ship's register. His pen lay uncapped across the page. Daniel shouted from somewhere below. Avery ran. He found him beside the crew quarters. Daniel held a metal mug. Jacob's. Avery knew it before Daniel said so. Jacob had carved his initials into the handle years earlier. Daniel touched the liquid inside. Still warm. Nobody knew what to say. They searched the meridian from bow to stern. Every cabin, every hold accessible without equipment. The engine room, storage compartments. The boats remained secured. 21 men had vanished. No bodies, no blood, no broken doors, no signs of struggle. One watchman's coat still hung beside the deck hatch. Ned Collins' cap remained near the lookout position. The ship was intact. The sea around them was empty except for the bellwether. Daniel stood at the rail staring at it. It happened while we were over there. Price said, we don't know that. The tea's warm. We don't know what happened at all. Daniel turned. My brother was here. I know. Then where is he? Price had no answer. Rourke did. Same place as theirs. Avery looked at him sharply. Enough. You read the book. I read what someone wrote. And now we're standing inside it. That silenced everyone. Avery ordered the meridian underway. It was not simple with 4 men, but they did not need speed. They needed distance. The engines came reluctantly to life. Smoke returned to the funnel. Avery set them on an easterly course toward shipping lanes they had passed days earlier. The bellwether began to fall behind. Daniel remained near the stern for almost an hour, watching it. Price eventually joined him. Go below. Eat something. I'm not hungry. Nobody is. Daniel stared toward the horizon. It's still there. Price looked. The bellwether remained visible through the thinning mist. Of course it is. We've been moving an hour. So has the current. Daniel said nothing. Another hour passed. The bellwether should have been gone. It wasn't. Sometimes fog obscured her. Whenever it cleared, there she was again. Not closer, not farther, simply present. Price checked their compass, then checked it again. Avery noticed. Problem? Nothing I can prove. What? Price lowered his voice. Heading doesn't match the swell. Avery looked toward the sea. Compass fault? Maybe. Can you fix it? If it's the compass. Rourke had been listening. You can't sail away from a place if the place doesn't want you leaving. Price turned. For God's sake. Rourke smiled faintly. You've another explanation? That evening, fog moved in from the north. It did not arrive dramatically. The horizon simply shortened. The bellwether vanished into it. Daniel seemed relieved. Then, shortly after sunset, Avery heard him shout. Jacob! He ran toward the sound. Daniel stood beside the passage leading below deck. Did you hear that? Hear what? My brother. Avery looked into the darkness. Daniel. He called me. From where? Below. Daniel started forward. Avery caught his arm. No. That's Jacob. You don't know that. I know his voice. Your brother isn't down there. Daniel pulled free. How do you know? Avery had no answer strong enough to satisfy him. They searched together. No Jacob. No one. When they returned to the deck, Rourke was gone. Price was the first to notice. Elias? They checked the chart room. His pipe lay on the table, still warm. Avery stared at it. Daniel whispered, No. They searched again. Nothing. 3 men remained. That night none of them slept. The fog thickened. At around 2 a.m, a ship's bell rang somewhere beyond the meridian. One strike, then another. Daniel lifted his head. Price looked toward Avery. The bell sounded again. Through the fog emerged the bow of the bellwether. Daniel stepped backwards. It should not have been there. They had left it hours earlier under power, yet it drifted past them barely 100 yards away. No lights, no crew, no sound except water against its hull. Then Daniel shouted, Jacob! Avery grabbed him. At the bellwether's rail, something had moved, or perhaps the fog had shifted. Daniel struggled. He's there. There's nobody there. I saw him. Daniel! Jacob! The bellwether slid into the mist. Daniel stopped fighting. He began to cry. Not loudly. Avery held him until the vessel disappeared. By dawn, Price was gone. Avery woke sitting against the bridge wall. Daniel slept nearby. Price had been at the engine controls less than an hour earlier. His tools remained beside them. The engines were still running. No Price. Daniel stared at the empty space. Where next? Avery said nothing. They reduced speed. There seemed little point in choosing a direction anymore. The compass now showed west despite the sunrise appearing where Avery expected east. He stopped trusting it. Daniel grew quieter throughout the morning. Around midday he asked, Do you think they're dead? Avery knew who he meant. I don't know. My brother. I know. If they're not dead, where did they go? Avery looked out at the blank horizon. I don't know. Daniel laughed bitterly. You've said that a lot. Aye. So has everyone. For a while they sat without speaking. Then Daniel's head turned. Avery saw the change in his face. What? Daniel stood. Jacob? Avery heard nothing. Daniel walked toward the stern. Daniel, he's calling. No. Daniel moved faster. Avery followed. The deck ahead was empty. Jacob! Daniel reached the rail. The bellwether was there. No fog concealed it now. It floated perhaps 200 yards away on a flat gray sea. Daniel stared. He's on it. Avery saw no one. Come away. He's there. Daniel climbed onto the lower rail. Avery pulled him down. Daniel struck him, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to shock both of them. "Let me go. There's nobody there." "You don't know that." Avery forced him back. Daniel fought until exhaustion took him. When Avery finally released him, the young man collapsed against the deck. The bellwether drifted away. Neither watched it disappear. Near sunset, Avery went below for water. He was gone less than 3 minutes. When he returned, Daniel was missing. Avery searched until darkness came. He called Daniel's name until his throat hurt. Nothing answered. The meridian belonged to him alone. For the first time since childhood, Thomas Avery prayed, not eloquently, not even hopefully. He simply sat in Captain Harrow's chair and asked whatever might be listening to let him see another human face. At dawn, the bellwether was gone. Avery searched the horizon repeatedly. Nothing. He almost laughed. The compass behaved normally again. The sea had regained its swell. A weak wind moved from the west. For 2 days, Avery kept the meridian running as best he could. He slept in minutes rather than hours. No one disappeared because there was no one left. No voices called him. No bells sounded. No other ship followed. On the third morning, he saw smoke. At first, Avery thought exhaustion had invented it. Then a mast appeared. Then a hull. A working steamer was approaching from the east. Avery stood at the rail and waved both arms. He fired a signal flare. The other vessel answered. He could see men gathering along its deck. Something inside him broke. He laughed and cried at once. The vessel changed course toward him. Avery stumbled toward the bridge to prepare a signal flag. As he passed Captain Harrow's desk, he stopped. The Meridian's logbook lay open. Avery did not remember opening it. He approached slowly. There was writing beneath the last entry made before the crew vanished. Fresh ink, 1 line, 4 men coming aboard. Avery stared at the words. Outside, voices carried across the water. He walked to the rail. The approaching vessel had stopped several hundred yards away. A boat was being lowered. Men climbed into it. Avery counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. He backed away from the rail. No. The 4 sailors began rowing toward the Meridian. Avery shouted, "Go back!" They were too far away. Or perhaps they couldn't understand. He waved his arms. "Don't come aboard!" The men continued rowing. Avery turned toward the bridge. For an instant, he thought he heard something below deck. A boot on metal. Then another. He froze. From somewhere deep inside the Meridian came the sound of a ship's bell. 1 strike. Avery looked toward the sea. There was no bellwether. Only the approaching boat. Another strike. Then silence. The 4 men reached the Meridian. No one stood at the rail to receive them. They called out. No answer. Their officer climbed first, then the second man, then the third, then the 4th. The deck was empty. The engines were cooling. A signal flare still smoldered where it had fallen. In the captain's cabin, the logbook lay open on the desk. There was no sign of Thomas Avery. Beyond the windows stretched an empty ocean. The men searched the ship. They found food, clothing, tools, personal belongings. They found no bodies, no damaged boats, no reason for the crew to have left. And several miles away, beyond a thin bank of morning mist, another vessel drifted slowly into view. It did not answer their signals. Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is the Long Tooth. The first dead sheep did not concern Ewan Fraser. There were plenty of things capable of killing livestock in the Highlands, most of them considerably less mysterious than farmers like to believe. Loose dogs were responsible for more damage than people realize. Foxes occasionally took smaller animals, and injured deer had an unfortunate habit of reaching inconvenient places before dying. The second sheep made him curious. It belonged to Donald Kerr, whose farm sat near the northern edge of Glen Torrin, where fenced pasture gradually surrendered to commercial forestry, and then to the older woodland climbing toward the hills. Donald had found the animal shortly after sunrise. By the time Ewan arrived, P.C. Isla Grant was already there. "You've been promoted to detective now?" she asked as he climbed through the gate. Ewan zipped his jacket against the October wind. Donald phoned me. Of course he did. Donald stood 20 yards away, staring at the damaged fence. At 68, he had officially retired from farming 4 years earlier and continued doing almost everything he'd done before retirement. His nephew handled the accounts and owned most of the livestock now, which Donald apparently considered an administrative technicality. Ewan joined him. What happened? Something got in. The sheep lay near the far edge of the field. Ewan didn't need to examine it closely to see that Donald was right. Whatever had killed it had dragged the carcass several meters toward the fence. Dog? Ewan asked. Big bloody dog. Isla approached behind them. That's what we're assuming. Donald glanced at her. You're assuming. Until someone reports a tiger missing, yes. Ewan crouched beside the fence. 2 sections of wire had been forced downward. Not cut, bent. What about the other one? Gone, Donald said. Completely? Donald nodded toward the woodland. Found wool on the fence. Nothing else. Ewan looked toward the trees. A dense plantation of spruce covered the lower slope beyond the field. Behind that lay older Scots pine and birch, then miles of broken woodland and more. Something moved beside his leg. Donald's sheepdog, Bracken, had followed them across the field. The old collie stopped several feet from the damaged fence. Come on, Donald said. Bracken didn't move. Donald clicked his fingers. The dog lowered its head. Bracken. Nothing. Donald frowned. In 11 years, Ewan had never seen that dog ignore him. Maybe he can smell whatever did it, Ewan said. Aye. Donald stared into the trees. Maybe. 3 days later, Ewan found the tracks. He worked for a forestry contractor responsible for several thousand acres around Glentoran, and most of his days were considerably less adventurous than people imagine. He inspected access roads, checked storm damage, marked unsafe trees, and dealt with fences that seemed capable of failing only in places furthest from his vehicle. The damaged section that morning bordered the same plantation as Donald's farm. Ewan expected deer tracks. Instead, he found deep impressions in the mud beside the road. At first glance, they resembled those of a large dog. Then he followed them. The spacing changed. For several yards, the marks fell in a recognizable 4-footed pattern. After that, only 2 deeper impressions appeared several feet apart. Then 4 again. Ewan crouched and photographed one. The mud had collapsed around its edges, making its shape difficult to determine. There appeared to be 5 long impressions at the front. He put his glove beside it for scale. Whatever had made it was large. 100 yards deeper into the plantation, Ewan found a dead roe deer. Something had dragged it from the track into the undergrowth. There were no obvious signs of a vehicle strike and no gunshot wound that he could see. He photographed that too. For the first time, he thought about Donald's missing sheep. The forestry company installed 2 trail cameras that afternoon. For 4 nights, they recorded nothing unusual. Deer passed through. A fox stopped to investigate the camera. Once, a badger occupied 6 minutes of footage, apparently determined to become the most thoroughly documented animal in Scotland. The 5th night produced 3 photographs. The first showed an empty forestry track at 2:17 a.m. The second showed something at the edge of the infrared illumination. Ewan enlarged it on his computer. The image was poor. A dark shape stood between 2 trees. He initially assumed it was a person. The third image, taken 2 seconds later, showed an empty track. His colleague suggested a walker. Ewan pointed out that the nearest public path was more than 2 miles away. Poacher, then? That was possible. Ewan saved the photograph anyway. A week passed without another livestock death. Then Ewan saw the thing himself. He had eaten dinner at his sister's house in the village and was driving Mary home from a friend's cottage farther along the glen. Rain had stopped an hour earlier, leaving the narrow road shining beneath the headlights. Mary was halfway through complaining about someone at work when she suddenly stopped. "Who's that?" Ewan saw the figure. It stood on the left side of the road near the trees, perhaps 60 yards ahead. He slowed. Bit late for a walk. Maybe their car's broken down. There was no vehicle. As they approached, the figure became clearer. It was tall, Dark clothing, Ewan thought initially. Perhaps a heavy coat. Should we stop? Mary asked. Ewan reduced speed further. The headlights reached it fully. His foot moved from the accelerator. Something was wrong. The figure's arms hung unusually low. Its shoulders were wide, but the waist beneath them narrowed sharply. Ewan couldn't distinguish clothing anymore. The darkness covering the body seemed uneven, coarse. The figure turned its head. Mary whispered, "Ewan." He locked the doors. The thing took one step toward the road. It wasn't a man. Ewan understood that before he had any idea what it was. Then the creature changed shape. Its upper body pitched forward and both long arms struck the ground. There was no stumble, no loss of balance. It simply dropped onto all fours as naturally as a dog beginning to run. Then it moved. Within seconds it had crossed the verge and vanished among the trees. Ewan stopped the car. Mary stared through the windscreen. What the fuck was that? He didn't answer. Neither suggested getting out. The following morning, Ewan went to Donald's farm. He described the roadside encounter without mentioning the trail camera photograph. Donald listened from the kitchen table. When Ewan described the arms, Donald stopped drinking his tea. When he described the creature dropping onto all fours, the older man put down the mug. That's not a man. I know that. Donald looked toward the window. Longtooth. Ewan waited for him to smile. He didn't. What? Old name. For what? Donald shrugged. Depends who you asked. Ewan sat opposite him. I'm asking you. When I was a boy, sheep went missing some winters. Folk blame dogs. Sometimes they blame Longtooth. You're serious. My father knew the name. His father knew it. What was it supposed to be? Something that lived up there. Donald gestured vaguely toward the hills. Some said an animal. Some said nonsense told to keep children from wandering into the woods. Why Longtooth? Donald picked up his tea. Same reason anything gets a name, I suppose. Somebody saw enough of it to name it. That was all he would say. Ewan remained unconvinced by the legend. He was considerably less unconvinced that something unusual lived in the forest. Isla took the trail camera photograph seriously enough to circulate it, although she pointed out that it proved very little. Could be a man. It ran on 4 legs. The photograph doesn't. I saw it. I believe you saw something. Ewan sighed. That's police language for saying you don't believe me. No. Police language would involve me writing down exactly what you said and letting somebody else decide. She handed his phone back. If there's a large animal loose, I'd quite like to know before somebody gets hurt. That evening, Ewan heard gravel moving outside his cottage. He was upstairs preparing for bed. One slow crunch, then another. He went to the window. Nothing stood beneath the security light. The sound stopped. Ewan waited. Several minutes later, it came from the rear of the house. He went downstairs and checked the back door. Locked. He turned on the garden light. Empty. Beyond the small garden stood a low fence, then rough grass leading toward the trees. Ewan watched for almost a minute. Nothing moved. He went back upstairs. At 1:40 a.m., something touched the side gate. The metal latch lifted. Ewan sat up. The gate creaked open. He didn't go downstairs. For nearly 20 minutes, he heard occasional movement around the cottage. Never hurried. It sounded almost casual. By 2 o'clock, everything was quiet. Morning revealed prints in the wet ground. They came through the gate, along the wall, around the back of the cottage, then beneath Ewan's bedroom window. There, the tracks changed. 4 impressions approached the wall. Only 2 led away. Ewan stood looking upward. His bedroom window was nearly 9 feet above the ground. Something had apparently risen beneath it. The prints returned to 4 several yards away and disappeared toward the trees. Ewan stopped sleeping with his curtains open. 3 nights later, something followed his van. He had been checking cameras in a forestry block and stayed later than intended. Darkness had settled by the time he reached the main access road. Halfway home, movement flickered between the trees on his left. Ewan glanced across. Nothing. 10 seconds later, he saw it again. a dark shape keeping pace beyond the reach of his headlights. He accelerated. The movement disappeared. Then it appeared ahead. Far ahead. Too far. Ewan felt his hands tighten around the wheel. He reached the junction and stopped. The headlights illuminated empty road. Ewan checked his mirror. Something stood behind the van, upright, perhaps 40 yards away. His brake lights painted the road red beneath it. Ewan stared. The creature lowered itself onto all fours. He accelerated. It came after him. For several seconds, the distance between them barely changed. Ewan reached 40 miles an hour before the creature finally veered into the trees. He didn't slow until he reached the village. Donald called the following afternoon. Bracken was missing. The dog's collar lay beside the far fence. Donald had already searched the nearby fields. Ewan joined him before sunset. They found tracks near the sheep shed. The same changing pattern. 4, then 2, then 4. Donald's getting dark, Ewan said. I can see that. We should go back. Donald carried an old shotgun broken over one arm. 5 more minutes. Something moved beyond the shed. Both men stopped. A branch cracked. Donald closed the shotgun. Inside. They entered the sheep shed and shut the heavy timber door. Ewan switched on his work torch. Outside, something crossed the gravel. Slowly. Donald raised the gun. The movement stopped beside the wall. They waited. A soft breath came from beneath the door. Ewan stepped backwards. The breathing moved away. For several seconds there was silence. Then something rose outside the small window. Ewan's torch found it. He saw dark, coarse hair first, then a head held low between powerful shoulders. The face was neither human nor canine. The muzzle was short and heavy, the nose broad and dark, with deep-set eyes reflecting only a dull trace of the torchlight. The creature looked directly at him. Its mouth opened. 2 upper canine teeth extended well below the lower lip. Not tusks, not the exaggerated fangs of some storybook beast. Teeth belonging to an animal built to use them. Donald whispered beside him. Longtooth. The creature turned away from the window. Ewan heard it move toward the door. The latch shifted. Once, then again. Ewan looked at Donald. It wasn't scratching randomly. It was testing it. The latch lifted halfway. Donald fired. The blast inside the shed was deafening. Something struck the outside wall. Then came a burst of movement so violent that Ewan heard gravel scatter against the timber. Silence followed. They waited 20 minutes before leaving. There was blood outside the door. Not much. A dark smear across the ground. The tracks disappeared into the forest. Donald lowered the shotgun. Now you've seen enough to name it. Ewan spent that night at Donald's farm. The next morning, Isla organized a search of the surrounding area with local officers and wildlife specialists. They found blood, tracks, nothing else. Nobody could identify the animal from Ewan's description. The official advice was simple. Stay away from the woodland after dark and report further sightings. Ewan had no intention of doing anything else. 2 evenings later, Mary arrived at his cottage. He had missed 3 of her calls while asleep on the sofa. She hammered on the door until he answered. What are you doing here? Checking you're alive. I told you not to come out here, and then you stopped answering. I was asleep. Well, congratulations. Ewan looked past her toward the car. Get inside. Mary saw his expression. What? Inside. She entered. Ewan locked the door. You're freaking me out. Good. Means you might listen. He checked the windows. Nothing. Mary folded her arms. Is this about the thing? Yes. Has it been back? No. Then why? A metallic click came from outside. Ewan stopped. The side gate. Mary heard it too. Neither spoke. Something moved across the gravel. Ewan turned off the living room lamp. Darkness filled the windows. Upstairs, he whispered. Why? Because I said so. They moved into the hallway. Something touched the back door. Not struck, touched. The handle moved downward. Mary stared at it. The handle returned slowly to position. A few seconds later, it moved again. Ewan took out his phone. No signal. He tried emergency calling. Nothing. The creature moved away from the door. They heard it pass beneath the kitchen window. Then around the side of the house. Ewan led Mary upstairs. They entered his bedroom. "Can we get to the car?" she whispered. "Not while it's outside." "What do we do?" "Wait." 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Nothing. Mary sat on the edge of the bed. "Maybe it's gone." Ewan approached the window carefully. The garden was empty. He checked the front. Nothing. He was beginning to think she might be right when something scraped across the roof below them. Ewan looked down. The kitchen extension had a low, sloping roof. Another scrape, then pressure against the gutter. "It's climbing." Mary backed away. A shadow passed across the window on the landing. They left the bedroom. At the far end of the corridor, the small box room window moved. Once, then again. The frame lifted. Ewan grabbed Mary. Downstairs. They reached the staircase as the window opened behind them. Something heavy entered the house. The floorboards creaked. Ewan and Mary ran. Behind them came a rapid series of impacts as the creature crossed the landing on all fours. They reached the hallway. The front door was 6 feet away. Ewan unlocked it. "Car, now!" They ran outside. Mary reached the passenger door. Ewan heard movement above them. The long tooth appeared at the upstairs window. For one instant, it crouched inside the frame. Then it disappeared backwards. Ewan got behind the wheel. The engine started. Mary shouted, "Go!" Ewan reversed hard onto the road. Something landed in the garden. The side gate burst open. The long tooth emerged. It stood upright in the headlights. Fully upright, it was taller than Ewan had realized. Its arms hung low beside its body. Blood darkened the hair around one shoulder where Donald's shot had struck it. The creature stared through the windscreen. Then it dropped. Both hands struck the road. Ewan accelerated. The long tooth charged. Mary screamed. The creature moved sideways at the last moment. Not fast enough. The front corner of the car struck it with a heavy impact. Its body rolled across the bonnet and vanished into the ditch. Ewan kept driving. He didn't look back. They reached the village 12 minutes later. Police returned with them after dawn. Blood stained the road beside the ditch. Coarse dark hair was trapped beneath the damaged bumper. Tracks led away through wet grass. They followed them for nearly half a mile. Then the ground became rocky. The trail disappeared. No body was found. The hair was sent for examination. The result, when it eventually came, told them almost nothing. The sample was badly damaged and contaminated with blood, mud, and material from the road. It appeared to be mammalian. Nobody could say what animal it belonged to. The livestock attacks stopped. October became November. The nights grew colder. Ewan returned to work, although he refused assignments requiring him to enter the northern forestry blocks alone. Mary teased him less than she once would have. Donald replaced the damaged fence. He never found Bracken. 6 weeks after the attack at Ewan's cottage, Donald asked him to come to the farmhouse. There was something on the kitchen table, an old photograph. The colors had faded almost completely. It showed Donald's farm beneath a pale winter sky. A younger version of Donald stood beside the gate with 2 other boys, all 3 staring unhappily toward the camera. Ewan picked it up. "When was this?" "Winter of '64. Ewan smiled. "You look miserable." "I was 12. Being photographed was apparently a great inconvenience." Ewan was about to put it down when Donald tapped the corner. "Look there." At the far edge of the field stood the woodland. Ewan moved the photograph closer to the window. Something dark stood between 2 trees. It might have been damage to the photograph. It might have been shadow, but the shape was upright, and its arms seemed to hang almost to its knees. Ewan looked at Donald. "You've had this the whole time?" "Found it after you hit the thing. Went through some of my father's boxes." "Did he ever talk about it?" "Once or twice." "And you didn't think to tell me?" Donald sat opposite him. "I spent most of my life thinking he'd seen a deer standing badly in poor light." Ewan looked again at the photograph. "Was this what started the stories?" "No. Name was older than him." "What did your father say he saw?" Donald considered the question. "Something standing at the edge of the trees. said it watched him for several minutes. When he went toward the house, it followed along the fence. Ewan studied the tiny dark figure. The same one? Donald didn't answer. Ewan looked up. You think that's the animal I hit? Donald leaned back in his chair. Ewan. He nodded toward the date written on the back of the photograph. That was 60 years ago. Outside the kitchen window, Glen Torrens stretched toward the dark line of forest. Beyond it lay miles of pine, moorland, mountains, and valleys where almost nobody went after sunset. Ewan looked once more at the photograph, then at the trees. For the first time, he found himself wondering whether the old stories had ever been about a single creature at all. Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is the voicemail. The first call came at 9:43 on a Wednesday evening. Hannah Reed noticed it only because she was carrying her phone from the kitchen to the sofa when the screen lit beneath her thumb. There was one missed call, and the name underneath made her stop. Hannah Reed. Her own name, accompanied by her own photograph and mobile number. For several seconds she stared at it, waiting for her brain to correct whatever mistake the phone had made before opening the call details and finding exactly the same information. A voicemail icon sat underneath. Hannah gave a quiet laugh and muttered, "Brilliant." Caller ID spoofing was the obvious explanation. She had heard of scammers making calls appear to come from banks, police stations, and local numbers, and making a call appear to come from the recipient's own number seemed like the sort of stupid trick somebody somewhere would find funny. She pressed play. The recording lasted 12 seconds. For the first few, there was almost nothing except a faint electrical hum. Somewhere farther away came a soft, metallic click, followed by a sound that might have been movement, and then the recording fell silent before ending. Hannah listened again, found nothing useful, and deleted it. At 29, Hannah had reached the point where living alone no longer felt like independence and no longer felt temporary. It was simply where she lived. Her flat occupied the 4th floor of a modern apartment building near the center of Manchester. The rooms were small but bright. The windows kept out most of the traffic noise, and the heating worked considerably better than it had in any property she had previously rented. She worked as an architectural technician for a medium-sized firm 15 minutes away by tram, spent too much money on coffee, and had recently begun attending a Thursday evening pottery class that she privately regretted but refused to quit because she had already paid for 8 sessions. Her older brother Ben claimed she possessed the most organized kitchen in Britain and the least organized wardrobe. Hannah claimed Ben had been 34 for almost a year and still phoned their mother to ask how long chicken took in the oven. They spoke often enough that neither bothered beginning most conversations with hello. Her phone rang while she was making tea. Ben wanted to know whether she had bought their father a birthday present yet. When Hannah said she had not, Ben sounded relieved and pointed out that this meant he was not technically behind either. Hannah reminded him that their father's birthday was still 3 weeks away, and they spent several minutes arguing about whose turn it was to organize something before moving on to their mother's latest attempt to arrange Sunday dinner around 5 adults who apparently all had incompatible schedules. By the time they hung up, Hannah had forgotten about the strange voicemail. She remembered it the following evening when another missed call appeared shortly after 8. Again, the caller was Hannah Reed, and this time there was a 30-second voicemail. Hannah hesitated before playing it. The recording began with the unmistakable hiss of her kettle. A television played quietly in the background, and although Hannah could not make out the program, the acoustics sounded familiar in a way she could not immediately place. A cupboard closed, footsteps crossed a hard floor, and then her own voice said, "Where did I put it?" The voicemail ended. Hannah remained still for several seconds before playing it again. There was the kettle, the cupboard, the footsteps, and her own voice. She looked towards the kitchen, but the flat was silent. The television was not on and the kettle was cold. She checked the time attached to the voicemail and saw that it had arrived at 8:14 p.m. when she had been sitting on the sofa. Somebody had compromised something. That was unpleasant, but it was still a problem with an explanation. Hannah checked which applications had microphone access, then Bluetooth devices, cloud sessions, and recent account logins. She opened her laptop and did the same there before changing her email password and her mobile account password. By 9 o'clock, she was irritated rather than frightened. She called her mobile provider the following morning. The man she spoke to confirmed that the voicemail had been delivered through their system, but he could not explain why the caller ID matched her own number. When Hannah asked whether the call could have been spoofed, he agreed that it was possible, although he could offer no explanation for the recording itself. She briefly asked whether she could block calls from her own number, then abandoned the idea when he advised her that blocking her own number was probably not sensible. 20 minutes later, while preparing for work, Hannah realized her access card was missing. She checked the hallway table and then the bedroom before returning to the kitchen, where she switched on the kettle while searching through a drawer. The television was playing the morning news in the living room. Hannah closed the cupboard above the sink, crossed the kitchen, and muttered, "Where did I put it?" Her body stopped before her mind caught up. The kettle boiled behind her while the television murmured from the next room. Hannah slowly looked towards the cupboard she had just closed, then towards her phone on the worktop. The second voicemail replayed in her memory with sudden clarity. She found the access card beneath a magazine a minute later and left for work, telling herself throughout the tram journey that the explanation remained perfectly ordinary. She had heard the recording, the words had stayed in her head, and that was probably why she had repeated them. Kettles boiled, cupboards closed, people walked across kitchens. Coincidences became impressive only when somebody actively looked for them. At 2:17 that afternoon, her phone vibrated. Another missed call from Hannah Reed. The voicemail was longer this time. Hannah put in her earphones and listened at her desk. Ben's voice came first, asking whether she was coming to their mother's house on Sunday. Hannah heard herself reply that she had already said she was. Ben told her she knew what their mother was like. Then after a brief rustle, he added, "Oh, and apparently Dad's bought another bloody barbecue." Hannah's recorded voice laughed and replied, "He hasn't even thrown out the last one." Ben then explained that somebody at work had sold it to him for 30 pounds. The recording ended. Hannah removed one earphone and looked around the office. Someone was discussing drawings near the printer. Another phone was ringing, and two colleagues were arguing quietly about lunch. Nothing around her had changed, yet the recording left her feeling as though something fundamental had. She checked her call history. Ben had not called. Hannah rang him immediately and asked whether he had phoned her earlier. Ben said he had not. She asked whether he had spoken to their father that day, then whether their mother had mentioned anything about a barbecue. Ben became increasingly confused and eventually asked what she was talking about. Hannah told him it was nothing and ended the call before he could question her further. For the rest of the afternoon, she kept checking her phone, but no further calls arrived. By 6 o'clock, she had almost convinced herself the voicemail was an old recording of some conversation she had forgotten. Then Ben called. He began by complaining about traffic, and the conversation was different enough that Hannah relaxed. A minute later, he said, "Mom wants to know if you're coming Sunday." Hannah's stomach tightened. She replied that she had already told their mother she was coming, and Ben said she knew what she was like. The rhythm was identical. Then he said, "Oh, and apparently Dad's bought another bloody barbecue." Hannah stopped walking. She was halfway between the tram stop and her building, and she knew exactly what she was supposed to say next. She remembered her recorded voice clearly. "He hasn't even thrown out the last one." She refused to say it. Ben continued speaking into the silence and explained that someone at work had sold their father the barbecue for 30 pounds. The order had changed. Hannah felt an immediate burst of relief until Ben joked that their father's garden was going to look like a graveyard for barbecues at this rate. Hannah laughed despite herself and said, "He hasn't even thrown out the last one." The words were already leaving her mouth when she realized what she had done. Ben continued for another moment before noticing her silence and asking whether she was all right. Hannah looked at the phone in her hand and quietly admitted that she was not. She told him about the voicemails. At first, she expected him to make a joke, but he did not. Ben asked her to send the recordings to him. Hannah explained that she had deleted the first one but forwarded the others, then waited outside her building while he listened. When he came back on the line, he admitted that the voices were unmistakably theirs. although he still wondered whether somebody could somehow have recorded them before. Hannah reminded him that the barbecue conversation had never happened until several minutes ago. Ben told her to lock the door and stay home for the night. He would come over the following day, and they could go through the phone properly. Hannah laughed at the suggestion that Ben was going to solve a technical problem, reminding him that he had asked her how to make a PDF only a month earlier. He replied that he knew useful things, and for the first time that evening, she smiled. The fourth voicemail arrived at 8:31. Hannah was sitting at the dining table when she played it. The recording lasted only 7 seconds. There was a sharp crash of breaking glass, followed by Hannah's own startled breath and the word, "shit." She looked around the room. The nearest fragile object was a wine glass beside her laptop, so she carried it into the kitchen and placed it carefully in the sink. Then she returned to the table and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and Hannah gradually began to feel ridiculous. By the time 45 minutes had passed, she was almost angry with herself for allowing a voicemail to dictate how she moved around her own home. At 46 minutes, her phone suddenly vibrated against the table. Hannah jerked at the unexpected noise and knocked her elbow against a glass bottle of water she had forgotten beside the laptop. It struck the floor and shattered. She stared at the pieces and whispered, "Shit." The notification on her phone was not another voicemail. It was an email. Hannah backed away from the broken glass. The recording had not merely predicted the accident. There was every possibility that hearing the recording had helped cause it. The next voicemail arrived shortly after 10. Hannah heard herself breathing rapidly while furniture scraped across a floor somewhere nearby. A lock clicked, then her own voice said, "Ben, just listen to me. I don't care how stupid it sounds. Something is happening." Ben answered indistinctly before the recording ended. Hannah called him immediately. He answered on the third ring and correctly guessed that she had received another message. When Hannah explained what she had heard, Ben said he was coming over. She told him not to because his arrival might be exactly what caused the recording to happen, but Ben insisted that he was not leaving her alone. Halfway through arguing, Hannah realized she had already said the first words from the voicemail. "Ben, just listen to me." She stopped speaking. The rest had not happened yet. That was when Hannah began to understand how dangerous incomplete knowledge could be. Every decision became suspicious. If she stayed home, perhaps she was fulfilling the recording. If she left, perhaps leaving was what caused it. If she called Ben, the call might be part of the sequence. But refusing to call him could create whatever panic she had heard in her own future voice. Ben arrived 20 minutes later. Nothing happened. The furniture did not scrape and the lock did not click. For almost an hour, Hannah began to feel better simply because another person was in the flat. Then Ben suggested that she stay at his house. Hannah stood to retrieve an overnight bag from the bedroom when her phone vibrated again. She looked at the screen and saw another call from herself. Ben noticed her hesitation and asked whether she was going to listen. Hannah said she did not want to, but after 30 seconds of staring at the notification, she admitted that not knowing was worse. The voicemail lasted 23 seconds. Hannah heard a dishwasher running in the background and the distinctive sound of a dog's claws crossing a wooden floor. Then Ben's voice said, "You're staying here tonight. End of discussion." That was all. Hannah looked at her brother and told him the recording had been made at his house. The dishwasher and the dog were unmistakable. Ben replayed it himself, and his expression changed when he recognized his own voice. They left immediately. At Ben's house, Hannah switched her phone off completely and placed it face down on the kitchen counter. Ben's partner was away visiting family, so the house was otherwise empty except for Milo, an elderly spaniel who showed no interest in Hannah's technological crisis. Ben made coffee while they went through every explanation they could think of. Malware, caller ID spoofing, cloud backups, old recordings and compromised accounts, all seemed possible until they returned to the conversation about the barbecue. Neither of them could explain how a recording could contain words Ben had not yet spoken. Hannah was halfway through suggesting that they contact the police, if only to create an official record of the harassment, when her phone vibrated on the counter. Both of them stopped speaking. The screen remained black. The phone was still switched off. It vibrated again. Ben quietly told her not to touch it, but Hannah approached anyway and picked it up. The screen illuminated, the phone started normally, and a notification appeared almost immediately. One new voicemail from Hannah Reed. Ben stared at the screen and said, "That's not possible." Hannah did not answer. She pressed play. The dishwasher ran in the background. Milo's claws clicked across the wooden floor, and Ben's recorded voice said, "You're staying here tonight. End of discussion." The voicemail ended. Hannah looked towards the dishwasher. It was not running. Not yet. Half an hour later, after Hannah suggested returning home for her work laptop and some medication, they argued. Ben eventually lost patience and told her, "You're staying here tonight. End of discussion." The dishwasher was running behind him. Milo crossed the floor. Neither of them needed to point it out. Ben sat down and rubbed both hands across his face before finally saying that he believed her. Hannah had expected those words to make her feel better. They did not. They stayed at Ben's house that night. The next morning passed without another voicemail, and by lunchtime, Hannah began wondering whether the phenomenon had stopped. Then her phone showed another missed call. This voicemail was different. It was longer and the sound quality was clearer. Hannah recognized her apartment almost immediately from the faint hum of the bathroom extractor fan. There was hurried movement, then her own breathing and the heavy scrape of furniture across the floor. A front door lock clicked. Ben said something she could not understand, and Hannah's recorded voice became quieter as she said, "Don't open the door." 3 evenly spaced knocks followed. Ben's voice said, "Hannah?" The recording ended. They listened twice. There was no scream, no impact, and nothing to reveal what happened after the final word. Hannah looked at Ben and said they were not going back. Ben agreed. For 6 hours they did not. Then their mother called Ben. She had received a blank voice message from Hannah's number and had been unable to reach her. Hannah checked her phone and found no outgoing message. By late afternoon, practical problems began accumulating. Hannah needed medication from the flat, her work laptop remained there, and so did documents she did not want to leave unattended indefinitely if somebody really had compromised her devices or access to the building. Ben offered to collect everything himself. Hannah refused because the recording contained his voice inside her flat. If he went there alone, she reasoned, perhaps that was how the future began. Ben pointed out that the recording contained Hannah as well, which meant staying away might not change anything. They were going in circles. Eventually, they chose what seemed like the least irrational option. They would return together while it was still daylight, collect everything they needed, and leave immediately. There would be no waiting around, no investigation, and no opening the door for anyone. The flat looked exactly as Hannah had left it. Nothing had been disturbed. Ben checked every room anyway while Hannah packed quickly. She collected her medication, laptop, chargers, documents, and enough clothes for several days. The bathroom extractor fan was running because Hannah had switched on the light without thinking, and when she noticed the sound, she turned it off immediately. Ben looked towards her and quietly reminded her that the fan had been in the recording. Hannah said she knew. They moved faster. A bag had fallen behind the narrow console table in the hallway. Hannah dragged the table away from the wall to retrieve it, and its wooden legs scraped across the floor. Both of them froze. Another sound from the voicemail. Hannah's breathing became shallow, but Ben reminded her that they were doing this to themselves. They had heard the recording, and now every ordinary action felt significant because they were waiting for it to repeat. Hannah forced herself to continue. They gathered the bags near the front door. Hannah checked that she had everything, then turned the lock. It clicked. Another sound. Ben looked at her, but neither said anything. Then someone knocked. 3 times. Hannah's entire body went cold. Ben turned towards the door, and Hannah immediately told him not to open it. He looked through the peephole. For several seconds, he said nothing. Hannah asked what he could see, and Ben stepped back with a confused expression. Nobody. There's nobody there. Hannah approached the peephole herself. The corridor was empty. Her phone began ringing. The caller ID showed Ben Reed. Ben stood beside her with his own phone in his hand. It was not making a call. Hannah declined it. 3 knocks came again. Ben suggested that somebody might genuinely need them, but Hannah repeated, "Don't open the door." The words hung between them. Ben looked at her and quietly said, "Hannah." Her stomach dropped. They had reached the end of the voicemail. Everything from that moment onward was unknown. Hannah's phone rang again. This time the caller ID displayed her own name. Neither of them answered. Then somebody spoke from the corridor. "Ben?" Hannah heard her own voice through the closed door. There was nothing distorted or unnatural about it. It sounded exactly like her, speaking from only a few feet away. Ben slowly turned towards his sister. The voice outside continued. "Can you open the door?" Hannah backed away. Ben whispered, "What the hell is that?" She could only tell him that she did not know. The voice outside spoke again. "Ben, it's me." He moved towards the peephole and Hannah told him not to, but he insisted that he needed to see. He looked into the corridor. Nobody was there. Then Hannah's voice came again, so close to the door that whoever was speaking should have been directly on the other side. "Remember Blackpool?" Ben's face changed. Hannah knew immediately what it meant. When they were children, Ben had fallen from a low sea wall during a family trip to Blackpool and split his chin open. Hannah, 6 years old at the time, had hidden behind an arcade machine because she thought their parents would blame her. Nobody outside their family knew that. The voice continued, "You told Mom I pushed you." Ben stared at Hannah. She quietly reminded him that she had been 6 years old. The door handle moved. Ben stepped backwards and Hannah grabbed his arm. The handle slowly returned to its original position. Her phone vibrated again. Another voicemail. Hannah did not touch it. Ben asked whether she was going to listen, but she shook her head. Every recording had shown something that later happened, and every time Hannah had tried to prevent one, she seemed to help create it. The broken glass, the conversation, their return to the apartment, and the knocks had all been shaped in some way by what she already knew. Hannah turned the phone face down and said, "I'm not listening to any more of them." Ben asked what she wanted to do instead. Hannah sat down beside the packed bags and told him they were going to do nothing. Outside, Hannah's voice called Ben's name again. They ignored it. Several minutes later, the voice changed. This time, Hannah heard Ben speaking from the corridor. His voice called her name and asked her to open the door. Ben closed his eyes but remained where he was. Then their mother's voice called from outside. That nearly broke them. Ben reached for his phone, but Hannah stopped him and pointed out that if their mother genuinely needed them, she could call normally. The voice outside became impatient, then frightened, then quiet. Eventually it stopped. An hour passed, followed by another. The corridor remained silent. Hannah checked the peephole only once and found it empty. They stayed inside until morning. Building security reviewed the hallway cameras after Ben explained that somebody had been outside Hannah's flat during the night. Nobody had. The footage showed the corridor remaining empty for the entire period. No person approached Hannah's door. Nobody stood outside it. Nobody knocked. Hannah never found an explanation. Neither did Ben. The voicemails stopped. Days passed, then weeks. Hannah changed phones anyway. She changed provider, replaced every password she had, and moved out of the flat 2 months later. Not because anything else happened there, but because she could no longer sit in the living room without listening for knocks. Life slowly became ordinary again. Hannah went to work, returned to pottery class, complained about her parents and argued with Ben. Eventually, she even stopped checking her voicemail immediately whenever her phone vibrated. 5 months passed. Then, one rainy Tuesday morning, Hannah was sitting at her desk when her phone lit up. One missed call. Her breath caught before she even looked at the name. Hannah Reed. For several seconds, she could not touch the screen. Eventually, she opened the notification. There was one voicemail. Hannah expected the usual timestamp. Minutes ahead, perhaps hours. Instead, beneath the recording was a date. August 14th, 2031. 5 years away. Hannah stared at the play button while people moved normally around the office behind her. The coffee machine hissed in the kitchen. Someone laughed across the room. A colleague walked past carrying a stack of drawings. For once, there was nothing frightening in the room. Nothing was approaching her, and there was nothing she needed to prevent. Hannah locked the screen, placed the phone face down on her desk, and never listened to the message. Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Watchtower. Ryan Cole had been working at Granite Peak for 23 days before he saw the light on Hollow Ridge. Until then, the job had been almost exactly what he wanted. Granite Peak Lookout stood on a steel frame 40 feet above a rocky summit in western Montana, high enough that the mountains seemed to spread beneath it rather than around it. On clear mornings, Ryan could see ridge after ridge disappearing into the blue distance, while thousands of acres of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and spruce filled the valleys below. Afternoon storms could be watched traveling towards him half an hour before they arrived, and sometimes golden eagles passed so close to the tower that Ryan could see individual feathers moving in the wind. At 28, Ryan had spent enough time explaining the job to friends that he had stopped trying to make it sound more complicated than it was. Most days, he watched the landscape for smoke, recorded weather observations, checked bearings with the firefinder mounted in the center of the cabin, and reported anything unusual to the ranger station. He maintained the tower, cleaned the solar panels, checked batteries, and logged lightning strikes after storms. Supplies arrived every week or two depending on road conditions, and otherwise Ryan saw nobody. He liked that part. This was his second season as a lookout, although his first at Granite Peak, and after years of seasonal conservation work, he had discovered that he was unusually comfortable with long stretches of his own company. There was no tragedy behind his decision to spend the summer on a mountain. Ryan had an environmental science degree, a collection of temporary jobs behind him, and no particular idea what he wanted to commit the next decade of his life to. His mother had suggested that disappearing into the wilderness for 4 months was simply an elaborate way of avoiding the question. Ryan had pointed out that avoidance rarely came with a salary and a view like this. The arrangement suited him, and although there were evenings when he missed restaurants, reliable internet, and conversations that did not involve wind direction, he had never once felt frightened by the isolation. His main contact with the outside world came through Dana Whitaker at Black Pine Ranger Station. Dana was 46, had worked for the Forest Service for more than 20 years, and spoke over the radio with the relaxed impatience of someone who had already dealt with 3 problems before breakfast. Their morning check-ins covered temperature, visibility, wind, and any developing fire activity, but on quiet evenings their conversations sometimes wandered. It was during one of those conversations that Ryan first asked about the old structure visible across the valley. Through binoculars, it looked like a small dark box balanced on the summit of a distant ridge. Dana told him it was Hollow Ridge Lookout and that it had not been staffed since the late 70s. When Ryan asked why it was still standing, Dana replied that nobody was particularly enthusiastic about hauling half a building down from a mountain nobody used anymore. The old access road had washed out in several places. The structure itself was considered unsafe, and Dana advised him to admire it from 7 miles away, rather than developing any romantic ideas about hiking across to explore it. Ryan laughed and assured her that climbing the staircase to Granite Peak several times a day already provided all the adventure he required. 3 weeks later, on a warm evening near the end of August, Ryan was sitting beside the western window with a paperback and a mug of coffee that had gone cold when he noticed a light inside Hollow Ridge. Sunset had almost disappeared behind the mountains, leaving only a thin red band above the horizon, and the forest below had become one enormous dark shape. Hollow Ridge was usually difficult to distinguish once daylight faded, but that evening a tiny yellow-white point shone clearly from the summit. Ryan put down his book and watched it for a while. Nothing about the light frightened him. People went places they were not supposed to go all the time, and an adventurous hiker deciding to spend a night inside an abandoned fire lookout made considerably more sense than anything sinister. He retrieved his binoculars and focused on the distant ridge. The remaining daylight was too weak to reveal much, but the glow appeared to be coming from inside the old cabin rather than from a campsite nearby. Ryan watched for movement and saw none. Eventually he returned to his book, occasionally glancing towards Hollow Ridge until the light disappeared roughly 40 minutes later. He mentioned it to Dana during the following morning's radio check. She confirmed that nobody from the Forest Service was working at Hollow Ridge and agreed that hikers were the most likely explanation. Ryan told her he was fairly certain someone had been inside the tower, and Dana promised to mention it because the structure was officially closed to the public. She also reminded him that reaching the ridge was not a 10-minute drive, and that unless somebody appeared to be in danger, nobody was going to launch an urgent expedition because a hiker had ignored a sign. Ryan agreed, looked across at the empty structure in the morning sunlight, and thought no more about it until evening. The following night he checked Hollow Ridge before the sun had fully set, although he told himself it was only curiosity. The ridge was empty. Ryan cooked pasta on the propane stove, cleaned the pan, and completed his evening log. When he looked again after darkness had settled, the light had returned. He raised the binoculars and watched it remain steady for perhaps a minute before it disappeared. A few seconds later it returned, vanished again, and then reappeared. At first Ryan assumed somebody was moving in front of a lantern, but the intervals soon became too regular. He lowered the binoculars and began counting. There were 3 short flashes, a pause, 3 longer flashes, another pause, and then 3 short flashes again. Ryan knew enough emergency signaling to recognize SOS without needing to check the reference sheet stored with the tower equipment. His amusement disappeared immediately. He contacted Black Pine Ranger Station and told Dana he was receiving what appeared to be an SOS signal from Hollow Ridge. Her tone changed at once. She asked him to maintain visual contact while she checked whether any hikers, survey crews, or Forest Service personnel were known to be in the area. Radio traffic filled the cabin for several minutes while Ryan watched the signal repeat across the valley. Nobody was supposed to be there. There were no active crews on Hollow Ridge, no known research teams, and no permits that explained the presence of someone inside the abandoned lookout. Dana eventually told him that a response team could not safely approach Hollow Ridge in darkness. The quickest usable route involved miles of damaged road, followed by a difficult hike, and they would begin the approach after sunrise. When Ryan asked what happened if the person was injured, Dana assured him that they were taking the signal seriously, but firmly instructed him not to attempt the crossing himself. Ryan had no intention of doing so. 7 miles of mountainous wilderness in daylight was one thing. Attempting it alone at night because a stranger was flashing a lamp was another. While they were speaking, the SOS stopped. Ryan watched the distant ridge for nearly a minute before the light began flashing again in a different pattern. He grabbed a notebook and started marking the sequence. His knowledge of Morse code was limited, but the emergency signaling reference provided the alphabet, and after several repetitions, he managed to translate the message. "Can you see me?" Ryan read the words twice before telling Dana. She asked whether he had any way to respond, and Ryan looked towards the powerful signal lamp mounted near the window. He positioned it towards Hollow Ridge, checked the reference sheet, and sent a simple answer. "Yes." The distant light went dark for almost 30 seconds before returning with another message. Ryan translated it as, "Who are you?" He answered with his first name, sending Ryan across the valley, 1 letter at a time. Another pause followed, and then the person at Hollow Ridge asked, "Are you alone?" Ryan frowned at the notebook. The question was slightly strange, but not impossible to rationalize. Someone in difficulty might simply want to know how much help was available. He told Dana what had been asked, and when she agreed that it was unusual, but not necessarily alarming, Ryan sent yes. Hollow Ridge remained illuminated for several seconds after receiving his answer, and then went dark. No further signal came that night. In daylight, the abandoned lookout looked incapable of producing anything. Ryan studied it through binoculars after sunrise and could make out weathered timber, broken windows, and a section of exterior walkway that appeared to sag away from the building. There was no visible tent, no smoke, and no person moving anywhere around the summit. A Forest Service crew attempted to reach Hollow Ridge that afternoon, but discovered that part of the old access road had washed out more severely than expected. Dana told Ryan they would try a northern approach the following day. During the conversation, Ryan asked how long Hollow Ridge had been abandoned. Dana thought the final season had been 1978, and initially remembered the last lookout as someone named Michael Trent. Ryan asked whether anything unusual had happened before the closure, and Dana laughed at his sudden interest in local history before admitting that she vaguely remembered hearing about an incident years earlier. She could not recall the details and said most of the old lookouts had closed for perfectly ordinary financial reasons anyway, but she promised to ask around. The light returned shortly after 10 that night. Ryan had been waiting for it, and the first message made him uncomfortable before he had even finished translating it. Ryan. There was nothing impossible about whoever was across the valley remembering his name, yet seeing it emerge one flash at a time from a mountain 7 miles away felt strangely intimate. Ryan answered with hello, and the response came quickly. Who are you? Ryan frowned. They had already asked that question the previous night. He signaled, you know my name, and received no answer. After waiting, he tried a question of his own and asked, who are you? The distant light remained steady for several seconds before flashing a single name. David. Ryan wrote it down and asked whether David was injured. The answer was no. When Ryan asked why he was at Hollow Ridge, nothing came back. He tried asking whether David had a radio and received another no. Then, before Ryan could send anything else, Hollow Ridge asked, can you help me? Ryan replied that rangers were coming. The person immediately asked when, and Ryan answered tomorrow. Hollow Ridge remained dark for so long afterwards that he assumed the conversation had ended. Then the light returned and flashed 2 words. Too late. Nothing else appeared before midnight. Dana contacted Ryan before the scheduled morning check-in. She told him that she had found the name of the last permanent lookout assigned to Hollow Ridge, and when Ryan asked whether it was David, the silence on the radio lasted long enough to make him regret the question. Dana asked how he knew the name. Ryan looked at the notebook beside him and replied, he told me. The man was David Mercer, 26 years old when he disappeared from Hollow Ridge in August 1978. His truck had remained parked near the old trailhead. His personal belongings and food were still inside the lookout, and search teams had spent 9 days covering the surrounding wilderness without finding him. There had been no confirmed fall, no evidence that he had deliberately hiked out, and no body. The case had never been solved. Ryan stared across the valley while Dana spoke. In the morning sun, Hollow Ridge looked utterly deserted. He suggested that somebody might know the story and be using David's name as part of an elaborate prank, and Dana agreed that it was possible. Ryan asked her to get someone into the tower as soon as she could. Dana assured him they were already trying. Later that afternoon, she contacted him again. She had been going through archived material at the district office and discovered that there was more to David Mercer's disappearance than she had remembered. Granite Peak had also been staffed in 1978 by a lookout named Charles Vance. During the nights before David disappeared, Charles reported seeing lights from Hollow Ridge, and the 2 towers had communicated using signal lamps. Dana began reading from Charles's daily log. Hollow Ridge had first signaled, "Can you see me?" and Granite Peak had replied, "Yes." Hollow Ridge then asked, "Who are you?" to which Charles answered with his own name. Ryan slowly opened the notebook containing his conversation from 2 nights earlier. When Dana continued and read the next question, "Are you alone?" Ryan interrupted her. He told her that he had received exactly the same messages in exactly the same order. Dana asked whether he had told anyone the full sequence before now. Ryan had not. He had reported the SOS and summarized the conversation, but nobody at the ranger station had been given a word-for-word transcript. Dana stopped treating the historical record as an interesting coincidence. It took almost an hour for photographs of the old report to reach Ryan's phone through the weak data connection. Charles Vance's handwriting was cramped but readable. Some of the conversation differed from Ryan's, while other sections matched closely enough to be disturbing. Hollow Ridge had asked for help. Charles had promised that assistance would come. Then the exchange became fragmented and difficult to follow. One line caught Ryan's attention. According to the report, Charles eventually signaled, "What can see me?" Ryan stared at the sentence. He had never sent those words. The response from Hollow Ridge had been, "Do not let it know where you are." Farther down the page, another message instructed Charles to turn off your light. According to the report, Hollow Ridge went completely dark shortly afterwards. David Mercer disappeared that night, while Charles Vance survived and resigned from the Forest Service within the week. Ryan read the pages twice. When evening came, he deliberately switched on every light in Granite Peak. It was partly stubbornness, and partly an attempt to prove to himself that a 48-year-old report was not going to dictate how he behaved. The cabin glowed warmly above the surrounding forest, while the valley disappeared into darkness. Hollow Ridge lit up shortly after 10. The first message was Ryan. Ryan ignored it. The name repeated several times, but he remained at the desk without touching the signal lamp. Eventually, the message changed to help, followed by, "It is here," and then "please." Ryan resisted for as long as he could. Someone might genuinely be trapped on that mountain. A person who knew the history of Hollow Ridge could have found David Mercer's name in an archive or newspaper report, and however elaborate the situation seemed, Ryan could not completely dismiss the possibility that there was a frightened human being asking for help. He switched on the signal lamp and asked, "What is there?" Hollow Ridge remained dark for several seconds before answering, "It watches the light." Ryan remembered the historical report beside him. Without consciously deciding to repeat it, he sent the most obvious question he could think of. "What can see me?" His hand stopped over the controls as soon as the final letter left Granite Peak. Those exact words had been written by Charles Vance in 1978. Ryan stepped backwards from the lamp. Hollow Ridge replied, "Do not let it know where you are." Ryan looked around his cabin. Every window reflected warm yellow light, and for the first time he considered how Granite Peak must look from below after dark. During daylight, the tower gave him an unobstructed view of the wilderness. At night, illuminated on top of a mountain, it became a beacon visible from miles away. The next message arrived. "Turn off your light." Ryan switched off the ceiling fixture, the desk lamp, and every equipment screen that could safely be darkened. His own reflection faded from the glass until the cabin seemed to disappear around him. Across the valley, Hollow Ridge flashed another message. Too late. The light paused before delivering one final sentence. "It can see you now." Hollow Ridge went dark. Ryan remained standing beside the desk, listening to the ordinary movements of the tower in the wind. 5 minutes passed without anything happening, then 10. He began to feel the first embarrassed relief that perhaps he had allowed a bizarre sequence of coincidences to frighten him. Then something touched one of the steel supports beneath the cabin. The sound was light, no more than metal contacting metal, but Ryan knew the normal noises of Granite Peak well enough to recognize something unfamiliar. A second sound came from the opposite side of the structure a few moments later. It was not the heavy impact of an animal running into a support or the irregular movement of branches in the wind. It sounded almost deliberate, as though something below was testing the tower. Ryan contacted Dana and explained what had happened. She listened without interruption before telling him that worsening weather had prevented the team from reaching Hollow Ridge, and that another crew was now heading towards Granite Peak. They were still several hours away. Dana then told him she had found the remainder of Charles Vance's statement. Charles had reported metallic noises beneath Granite Peak on the same night David Mercer disappeared. He had also heard footsteps on the exterior staircase. Ryan asked what Charles had done, and Dana told him that he had switched off every light, remained inside the cabin, and waited until sunrise. Shortly before dawn, the sounds had stopped. While Dana was speaking, the first stair below Ryan creaked. He turned towards the door. After a long pause, another stair groaned under weight. Ryan lowered his voice and told Dana that something was climbing the tower. She instructed him to lock the cabin, stay inside, and keep the lights off. Ryan assured her that the door was already secured and that he had no intention of leaving. Another stair creaked, then another. The sound stopped somewhere below the upper platform. Ryan stood in the center of the dark cabin and tried to judge the distance. He considered using the flashlight beside his bed, but remembered the message from Hollow Ridge and left it untouched. For several minutes, nothing moved. The radio crackled. Dana's voice called his name. Ryan lifted the handset and answered, but no response followed. Static filled the speaker, and when he tried again, the interference briefly cleared enough for another voice to emerge. "Can you see me?" Ryan stared at the radio. The voice was too faint for him to tell whether it belonged to Dana, a man, or simply static arranging itself into something his frightened mind recognized as speech. It repeated the question once more. "Can you see me?" Ryan switched the radio off. The cabin became silent again. 3 slow knocks sounded beneath the floor. Ryan moved away from the center of the room. The windows surrounding him reflected almost nothing, and outside was a depthless black expanse, where mountains, trees, and sky had merged together. Another stair creaked somewhere below, but Ryan could no longer tell whether the sound was getting closer or farther away. Then the light on Hollow Ridge returned. Ryan almost felt relieved to see it. He did not answer. Instead, he took the notebook and translated the signal as it repeated across the valley. "Do not answer." A second message followed. "I am not David." Ryan read the words twice. If whoever had been signaling from Hollow Ridge was not David, then the name had been a lie. He began wondering whether David Mercer had ever sent any of the messages in 1978, or whether Charles Vance had simply assumed he was communicating with the man assigned to the opposite tower. Perhaps David had already disappeared before the lights began. Perhaps the person, or whatever was producing them, had used David's identity because it was the name Charles expected. Another message began flashing. "Do not look down." Ryan felt an immediate urge to approach the window and look beneath the tower. He forced himself to remain where he was. A board creaked on the exterior walkway. The sound was no longer beneath him. Something had reached the top. Ryan kept his eyes on Hollow Ridge while slow pressure moved along the wooden walkway outside the western windows. He saw no silhouette and no shape passing through the darkness. The boards simply creaked one after another as though supporting weight. The movement stopped beside the door. The handle lowered slightly. Ryan watched it from several feet away. It returned to position, then moved again. He thought of Charles Vance sitting inside the same cabin in August 1978, surrounded by the same windows and listening to something test the same door. Whether Charles had understood what was happening or had simply spent the rest of his life refusing to discuss it, Ryan could not know. Hollow Ridge sent one more message. "Stay dark." Ryan obeyed. For the next 2 hours, Granite Peak produced sounds he would never afterwards describe with certainty. Sometimes he believed something was walking around the exterior platform. At other times, the stairs creaked from somewhere below. Once he heard a faint dragging sound against one of the steel supports, slow enough to resemble fingers moving along metal, although he knew that comparison came from imagination rather than evidence. Nothing struck the windows or attempted to force the door. The restraint made the waiting worse because whatever was outside seemed perfectly willing to remain there. Shortly after 4 in the morning, the radio switched itself on. Ryan heard the click from across the cabin. Static filled the speaker. He had turned the unit off himself. Dana's voice emerged clearly enough that Ryan almost answered. She called his name and told him the rescue team was close. Then she instructed him to turn on the tower lights so they could locate him. Ryan took one step towards the controls before stopping. Dana knew about Charles Vance's report. She had specifically told him to stay dark. The voice repeated the instruction, asking him to turn on the lights. Ryan stepped away. Static swallowed Dana's voice. Then Ryan heard himself speaking through the radio. "Can you see me?" The transmission ended. Outside, the boards beside the door creaked once more. A moment later, the staircase began to groan, one step at a time, as whatever had reached the top appeared to descend. Ryan remained in darkness until the eastern sky began to change. At first, the black outside the windows merely became less complete. Then mountain silhouettes returned against deep blue and individual ridges slowly separated from one another. Trees emerged below the tower. Ryan waited until sunlight touched the upper windows before switching the radio on. Dana answered immediately. Ryan asked where she was, and she told him the crew was roughly 40 minutes away. He almost asked whether it was really her before deciding there was no answer she could give that would prove anything over the radio. He finally looked outside. The exterior walkway was empty. The staircase was empty. Nothing beneath the tower appeared disturbed, and there were no tracks or marks that could explain what he had heard. Across the valley, Hollow Ridge stood beneath the morning sun. Ryan examined it through binoculars. The old lookout looked exactly as it always had, with broken windows, weathered timber, and no sign that anybody had occupied it for decades. Ryan did not stay at Granite Peak another night. Dana arrived with 2 Forest Service employees shortly after 8. She took one look at him and did not try to convince him otherwise. They gathered his personal belongings, secured the tower, and descended together. No official explanation accounted for everything that happened. Trespassers at Hollow Ridge remained possible despite the difficulty of reaching it. Radio interference might have explained some of what Ryan heard, and exhaustion could account for other details. Nobody offered a convincing explanation for a sequence of Morse code messages matching a document written in 1978. Ryan stopped asking. He stayed with a friend in Missoula for several days while deciding whether to accept another seasonal assignment. He had begun convincing himself that leaving Granite Peak was enough when Dana called and asked him to come to the district office. When Ryan arrived, Dana was waiting in a small records room with Charles Vance's file open on the table. She told him that something had changed. There was another page attached to the statement, and Dana was certain it had not been there when she first reviewed the file. Ryan asked whether it could have come from another copy or been misfiled. Dana had already checked. The page matched the rest of the statement, including the paper, typewriter, and archive markings. As far as the district office was concerned, it had always been there. Ryan sat opposite her and began reading. Charles described remaining inside Granite Peak until shortly before dawn. He recorded the same metallic sounds beneath the tower, the same footsteps on the stairs, and unexplained interference through the radio. The account matched what Ryan already knew until an entry timed at 4:46 a.m. Charles reported seeing another light. It was not coming from Hollow Ridge. According to his statement, Hollow Ridge had been completely dark. The new light appeared on another ridge across the valley, in a place where Charles knew there was no active lookout. As the sky began to brighten, he was able to distinguish the outline of a tower around the light. Charles described it as Granite Peak. Ryan read the paragraph again. Charles Vance had been sitting inside Granite Peak while looking across the valley at another Granite Peak. The report continued. The impossible second tower began signaling shortly before sunrise, and Charles recorded the Morse sequence at the bottom of the page. I am not Ryan. Ryan stared at the sentence until the letters began to lose meaning. Dana quietly reminded him that Charles Vance had written the statement in August 1978. Ryan did not need reminding. Charles could not have known his name. He closed the folder and asked whether anyone had returned to Granite Peak since he left. Dana told him no. Hollow Ridge had not yet been inspected either because the district was waiting for helicopter access. Ryan stood and told her he wanted to go. Dana remained seated for a moment before telling him there was one more thing. A patrol ranger had driven through Black Pine the previous night and stopped on the Western Service Road because he thought somebody had reopened Granite Peak. From several miles away, he had seen a light inside the cabin. Ryan reminded her that the tower had been shut down and asked whether the batteries had been disconnected. Dana confirmed that the interior lighting had been disabled before they left. The ranger had recorded a short video. Dana placed her phone on the table and played it. Granite Peak was barely visible against the dark mountain, but a tiny yellow-white light shone from the cabin. Ryan watched it disappear and return in a deliberate sequence. There were 3 short flashes, followed by 3 long flashes, and then 3 short flashes again. SOS. The light remained steady for several seconds before another sequence began. Ryan watched the first few flashes and felt the same cold certainty he had experienced on the mountain. He no longer needed a Morse reference sheet to understand them. The message was asking a question. Can you see me? Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Last Train. Catherine Hughes nearly missed the last train home because a client decided at 11:17 on a Wednesday night that the color of a title sequence suddenly mattered more than it had during the previous 3 weeks. By the time she left the post-production office near Soho, the streets had thinned considerably from their daytime rush, and the city had taken on that late-night character Catherine had always found strangely peaceful. Delivery bikes still moved through junctions, taxis drifted past with illuminated signs, and pubs emptied groups of people onto pavements. But the constant pressure of the day had gone. Catherine was 32 and had worked as a production coordinator long enough to know that phrases such as "one tiny change" and "should only take 5 minutes" rarely meant either of those things. She had spent most of the evening relaying messages between an editor who wanted to go home, a producer who had stopped answering calls, and a client reviewing exports from somewhere considerably more comfortable than the office. When the final version was approved, Catherine shut down her computer, collected her coat, and hurried towards Charing Cross with the exhausted satisfaction of somebody who had spent 12 hours solving problems nobody would remember by breakfast. The station was quiet without being deserted. A cleaner pushed a wide mop across the concourse while two men in office clothes stood beneath the departure board, debating whether they had time to buy food. Somewhere beyond the barriers, an automated announcement reminded passengers not to leave luggage unattended. Catherine bought a bottle of water from a vending machine, checked that the final train towards Orpington was still running, and boarded with less than 3 minutes to spare. There were 7 other passengers in the carriage, enough to make it feel occupied, but not busy. A man in a dark suit slept against the window with his tie loosened, while a woman roughly Catherine's age sat several rows ahead, reading a paperback beside a canvas shopping bag. Across the aisle, a university-age student wearing large headphones scrolled through his phone. Farther down, a young couple sat close together, sharing something on one screen and trying not to laugh too loudly. Near the doors, an exhausted woman in Navy hospital scrubs beneath a winter coat stared straight ahead, and behind Catherine, beside the connecting door, an elderly man in a brown overcoat rested both hands on an old leather satchel. Catherine chose a window seat and plugged her phone into a portable charger. She lived alone in Orpington, having moved there 18 months earlier because she wanted somewhere quieter without abandoning London completely, and she knew the journey well enough that she rarely paid much attention to it. Her mother had sent 2 messages asking whether she was still working, followed by a third reminding Catherine that she had promised to come for lunch on Sunday. Catherine replied that she was finally on the train and added that if anyone mentioned title fonts to her before morning, she intended to become violent. Her mother responded with a laughing face and told her to get home safely. The train pulled away from Charing Cross and settled into the familiar rhythm of a late-night suburban service. For the first several minutes, nothing happened. Stations passed. The man in the suit remained asleep. The young couple continued whispering and laughing over their phone. Catherine watched buildings slide by outside, then lowered her eyes to her own screen and began clearing messages she had ignored during the evening. When the train entered its first tunnel, the window became a black mirror, and Catherine saw her own tired reflection beneath the fluorescent carriage lights. The darkness lasted only a short while, and when the train emerged, she went back to her phone without thinking about it. Several minutes passed before Catherine noticed that the woman with the paperback was gone. The seat ahead was empty, although the book remained behind, closed now with its cover facing upward. The canvas shopping bag had disappeared. Catherine glanced towards the toilet indicator, farther along the carriage, and then towards the connecting doors. She assumed the woman had moved. Perhaps she had gone to another carriage to make a call, or perhaps Catherine had missed a stop while looking at her phone, and the woman had left in a hurry, forgetting the book. People left things on trains constantly, and there was nothing particularly strange about an empty seat. The second tunnel arrived 10 minutes later. Catherine barely noticed it until darkness filled the windows again, and the reflections of the carriage lights stretched across the glass. The young couple were still visible farther down, the man holding the phone while the woman leaned against his shoulder. When the train emerged, only the young woman remained. The seat beside her was empty. Catherine looked toward the connecting door, expecting to see the boyfriend standing somewhere nearby, but he was nowhere in sight. The young woman continued scrolling through her phone as though nothing had happened, and after nearly a minute, Catherine became curious enough to stand and walk down the aisle. She stopped beside the seats and asked, "Sorry, did your boyfriend go to another carriage?" The woman looked up with a puzzled expression and replied, "My what?" Catherine smiled automatically, expecting the misunderstanding to correct itself, and explained that she meant the guy in the gray hoodie who had been sitting beside her. The woman glanced at the empty seat, then back at Catherine, and said she had boarded alone. Catherine returned to her seat feeling mildly embarrassed, but the explanation bothered her. She remembered the couple laughing together. She remembered the man showing the woman something on his phone, and the woman covering her mouth to stop herself laughing too loudly. More strangely, the young woman's handbag now rested on the seat where Catherine remembered the boyfriend sitting. It was not merely that he had gone. The space he had occupied seemed to have been quietly reclaimed, as though nobody had ever been there. Catherine looked towards the paperback abandoned several rows ahead. The student with headphones sat closest to it. She caught his attention, and when he removed one earphone, she asked whether he had noticed where the woman who had been reading went. The student looked toward the empty seat and said he had not seen anyone there. Catherine pointed at the book, but he only shrugged and suggested that somebody had probably left it on an earlier service. That was the first moment Catherine genuinely questioned her own memory. She had been exhausted when she boarded. Perhaps she had mentally combined passengers from the platform with people in the carriage. Perhaps the young man had not been part of the couple at all. Perhaps the reader had left before the tunnel and Catherine simply had not noticed. There were explanations for everything if she was willing to admit that she might have been mistaken. She checked the time and frowned. They should already have been considerably closer to Orpington. The journey had gone on longer than expected, yet the train was still moving at a steady pace. Catherine opened the Rail app, but the live journey page refused to update. Her phone had lost signal, which was not unusual in tunnels, although they were no longer inside one. Then the electronic display above the doors changed. Next station, Belweir. Catherine stared at the name. She knew the route, and there was no Belweir station on it. The student noticed the display too and looked briefly confused before returning to his phone. A moment later, the automated announcement played through the speakers in the same calm voice Catherine had heard hundreds of times on trains. The next station is Belweir. Passengers for onward services should remain on this train. The sentence sounded almost normal, which made it worse. Catherine could not think of any reason passengers changing services would be told to remain aboard. She checked the route map above the doors, but Belweir did not appear there. The train did not slow when the platform finally arrived. Catherine saw bright lights, tiled walls, benches, and a station sign bearing the same unfamiliar name, but there were no people anywhere. The platform disappeared behind them within seconds. When Catherine looked across the carriage, the elderly man in the brown overcoat was watching her. As soon as their eyes met, he looked away. The display changed again several minutes later. Marden Vale. Catherine had never heard of that either. She stood and walked towards the connecting door, deciding that finding a member of staff made more sense than continuing to stare at signs. The next carriage was completely empty. Every seat was vacant, and there was no luggage or rubbish to suggest anyone had been there recently. Catherine stepped inside, only far enough to look down its length, saw another connecting door at the far end, and returned immediately. The elderly man was watching her again, so Catherine approached and asked whether he knew what was happening with the train. He looked up and asked what she meant. Catherine gestured towards the electronic display and told him they were nowhere near the normal route. The man glanced at the words Marden Vale and said he did not know the station. Catherine told him she had noticed him looking at her. He replied that he had been looking out the window, and when Catherine pointed out that there was almost nothing to see, he gave a faint, humorless smile and said, "That is generally when people look hardest." Catherine did not have time to decide whether that was profound or simply annoying because the train entered another tunnel. The carriage windows turned black, and Catherine automatically looked towards the remaining passengers, almost expecting another empty seat when the train emerged. Instead, movement appeared outside. A human figure stood beside the tracks. They passed it so quickly that Catherine saw only a dark outline. Another figure appeared beneath a maintenance light farther ahead, then another. The train was traveling at speed, yet the shapes remained beside it. Catherine leaned slightly closer to the window and saw one figure level with the rear of the carriage. The next burst of tunnel light showed another beside her own window. A few seconds later, one appeared farther ahead. At first, Catherine assumed they were running. Then she realized she could not see any movement in their legs. Their position simply changed between the patches of light. One moment, a figure stood 50 yards behind. The next, it was beside her, and then another seemed to be ahead of the train without Catherine ever seeing it move between those places. She pulled away from the glass. The elderly man said quietly, "Don't look at them." Catherine turned towards him and asked what they were. He replied, "I don't know." That answer frightened her more than any elaborate explanation would have. The train emerged from the tunnel. Catherine counted the passengers immediately. The sleeping man remained by the window. The student still had his headphones. The young woman sat alone, and the hospital worker remained near the doors. The elderly man was still beside Catherine, 5 passengers besides herself. She looked towards the reader's empty seat and then towards the place where the boyfriend had been sitting. The elderly man followed her gaze and asked, "You remember them?" Catherine stared at him. "The woman with the book?" He nodded. Catherine asked about the young man in the gray hoodie, and he nodded again. She sat opposite him. The old man introduced himself as John Neal. Catherine gave him her name, and when John said he already knew it, she immediately became suspicious until he reminded her that she had spoken to her mother earlier. Catherine could not remember using her surname, but there were more pressing questions. John told her that the first time something like this happened to him, he had spent too long trying to understand it. He had asked other passengers what they remembered, argued with staff, and moved between carriages looking for an explanation. None of it had helped. Catherine asked what he meant by the first time, and John hesitated before asking her what year it was. When Catherine told him it was 2026, he nodded slowly and said that sounded about right. Catherine asked how long he had been on the train. John explained that he first encountered the journey in 1989 when he had been 29 years old. He had been traveling home with his wife, Margaret. The train had been different then, as had the route, but the pattern had been the same. Passengers disappeared after tunnels, and almost everyone immediately forgot that those people had ever been aboard. Catherine asked whether John had been trapped on the train ever since. He shook his head and explained that he had returned to ordinary life after the first journey, only to encounter the phenomenon again years later. It had happened 5 times in total. Sometimes he boarded a late train, sometimes an ordinary afternoon service. Sooner or later, somebody vanished, and the journey began to change. "What happened to your wife?" Catherine asked. John looked down at the leather satchel. "She disappeared." He removed an old photograph and handed it to her. It showed a much younger John standing beside a seaside railing with one arm raised awkwardly around empty space. John explained that Margaret had been standing beside him when the photograph was taken. She had her arm around his waist, and he had his around her shoulders. After she vanished from the train, the photograph changed. Catherine studied the empty space. "What about her family?" They didn't remember her. Margaret had 2 sisters. Afterwards, everyone remembered there being one. "Marriage records?" John shook his head. There was no marriage certificate, no employment record, no photographs containing Margaret, nothing that proved she had ever existed. Catherine handed the picture back and asked why he kept it. John said, "I don't need it to remember her. I keep it because the empty space proves something was taken." The carriage lights flickered. John's expression changed immediately. He looked toward the darkening window and told Catherine that when the next tunnel came, she needed to close her eyes and behave as though she were asleep. Catherine asked why, and John admitted he did not know exactly. He had learned only that passengers who reacted to what moved through the carriage seemed more likely to disappear. The tunnel swallowed the train. Catherine closed her eyes. At first, there was only the normal sound of wheels against track. Then the connecting door opened. Footsteps entered the carriage. They sounded like ordinary shoes. The steps moved slowly along the aisle, stopped somewhere ahead, and remained still for several seconds. Then a voice whispered a name. "Daniel?" Catherine recognized the student's voice when he answered sleepily. "Yeah." Silence followed. The footsteps resumed and moved towards Catherine, passed her without stopping, and continued toward the far door. A moment later, the connecting door opened again. When the train emerged from the tunnel, Catherine opened her eyes. Daniel's seat was empty. His headphones were gone. His phone was gone. There was no trace that he had been there. The hospital worker glanced at the empty row without interest. The young woman continued looking at her phone. Catherine turned to John and asked what had happened to Daniel. John told her he did not know. When she demanded to know where the missing passengers went, John said that if he had ever discovered that, he would probably not still be taking trains. Catherine asked why they could remember when everyone else forgot. John had no answer. He had spent 37 years thinking about it and had never found one. He suspected that remembering made them easier for whatever moved through the tunnels to notice. That was why he had pretended not to remember the missing passengers when Catherine first approached him. He had been hoping to appear like everyone else. The idea made Catherine uncomfortable in a new way. The other passengers were not simply oblivious. Their ignorance might be protecting them. Marden Vale appeared outside without the train stopping. The platform was longer than Belware and carried signs advertising connections to places Catherine had never heard of, yet there seemed to be no additional tracks. The whole station had been constructed for journeys that did not exist. Catherine's phone still showed no signal. The clock displayed 11:58 p.m. and did not change no matter how long she watched it. The next tunnel came sooner than she expected. Catherine closed her eyes before John told her to. The connecting door opened again, followed by the same steady footsteps. This time they stopped beside Catherine. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then Catherine heard her mother's voice. "Catherine?" Every muscle in her body tightened. Her mother could not possibly be there. The voice continued gently. "Kath, love, wake up." Catherine remained motionless. The imitation was exact. There was no strange distortion or unnatural tone. It sounded like her mother standing beside the seat. After another pause, the voice changed. It became Catherine's own. "I know you're awake." Her breath almost caught. John's hand reached across the space between the seats and squeezed hers once. Catherine kept her eyes closed. The footsteps remained beside her for several seconds longer before slowly moving away. When the train emerged from the tunnel, the hospital worker was gone. Only Catherine, John, the sleeping businessman, and the young woman remained. Catherine moved into the seat beside John. She asked him about Margaret, not because it solved anything, but because the thought of a person disappearing so completely disturbed her, more than the unknown thing moving through the tunnels. John told her Margaret had loved crime novels and could not walk past a bookshop without entering. She was a terrible cook, hated coriander, and disliked trains even before the night she disappeared. Catherine asked how they met, and John said it had been at a friend's birthday party where Margaret had told someone within earshot that John seemed boring. They married 2 years later. "What happened in the tunnel?" Catherine asked. John explained that Margaret heard her younger sister calling from another carriage. He tried to stop her answering, but Margaret was convinced the voice was real. When the lights came back, she was gone. Another tunnel took the sleeping businessman. The young woman disappeared in the one after that. Eventually, Catherine and John were the only passengers left. The carriage looked enormous now. Rows of empty seats stretched ahead beneath fluorescent lights, and Catherine could remember exactly where each person had been sitting. John encouraged her to keep remembering them. He had no evidence that memory helped the missing, but forgetting felt too much like cooperating with whatever had removed them. The display above the doors changed. Ashcombe End. John went pale. Catherine asked whether he knew the name. John said he knew the place, although it had been called something else in 1989. The train began to slow. For the first time in what felt like hours, Catherine's phone vibrated. Signal returned with full bars. She opened maps and stared at the location indicator. Her flat was less than half a mile away. "This is home," she told John. He shook his head and told her it was not. Catherine showed him the map, but John barely looked at it. He explained that Ashcombe End was the station where Margaret had appeared after disappearing from the train. Catherine reminded him that he had said Margaret vanished in a tunnel. "She did," John replied. "Then the train stopped. I saw her on the platform." The station appeared outside. It looked completely ordinary. Modern signs, benches, ticket machines, and an illuminated exit stood beneath bright white lighting. Catherine recognized buildings beyond the platform. She could see a road she knew. The train stopped. The doors opened. A calm announcement played through the carriage. This service terminates here. All remaining passengers must leave the train. Catherine looked at her phone again. According to the map, she could walk home in 11 minutes. She told John this might genuinely be the way out. John said, "That is exactly what I thought the first time." The announcement repeated. This time it said, "Catherine Hughes, please leave the train." Catherine froze. John took her arm. A third announcement followed. "Catherine Hughes, this is your stop." Then Catherine saw her mother on the platform. She stood near the exit wearing the same coat Catherine had seen her in the previous weekend. She noticed the train and waved, looking confused at first and then worried. Catherine stood automatically. John pulled her back down and told her that the woman outside was not her mother. Catherine said she looked exactly like her. John replied that he knew. Her mother walked closer to the open doors and called Catherine's name. Catherine took one step towards the aisle before John stopped her again. Then somebody farther down the platform said, "John?" He went completely still. A woman stood beneath the Ashcombe End sign. She looked around 30 years old with dark hair and a blue coat. John whispered Margaret's name. Catherine turned towards him. The woman smiled and walked closer. John released Catherine's arm. Catherine immediately realized what was happening and stepped in front of him. She reminded him that he had spent the entire journey warning her not to leave the train and had specifically said the station was not real. John told her he knew. Margaret stopped several yards from the open doors and said something too quietly for Catherine to understand. John's face changed. Catherine asked what she had said. John explained that the words were the same thing Margaret had whispered to him on the morning of their wedding. "That doesn't mean it's her," Catherine said. John agreed. He knew that better than anyone. That was what made the decision written across his face so painful. He opened the leather satchel and gave Catherine the photograph. Then he asked her to remember Margaret Neal. He told Catherine that Margaret was 29 when she disappeared, that she loved crime novels and hated coriander, that she was a terrible cook and had once believed John was the most boring man she had ever met. Catherine told him not to go. John smiled faintly and said, "I have spent 37 years remembering someone the rest of the world says never existed. If that isn't her, then I know exactly what I'm risking. If it is her, I'm not leaving her here again." Catherine had no answer that could compete with 37 years. Margaret held out her hand. John stepped onto the platform. Catherine followed only as far as the threshold. John crossed towards Margaret, and the young woman took his hand. The doors closed between them. Catherine pressed one palm against the glass. John looked back. He did not appear frightened. The train moved. Ashcombe End slid away. Within seconds, the carriage entered another tunnel. Catherine was alone. The announcement returned and told her to prepare to leave the service. She ignored it, lay across two seats, and closed her eyes. The connecting door opened. Footsteps entered. They stopped beside her. John's voice spoke softly. "Catherine, it's all right. I found a way out." She remained still. He told her Margaret was really there and that the platform was safe. Catherine did not move. Then a woman's voice spoke beside her. "Please remember me." Margaret. Catherine had heard her only briefly at Ashcombe End, yet the voice was unmistakable. Tears gathered at the corners of Catherine's eyes, but she kept them closed. The footsteps remained beside her for what felt like several minutes. Eventually they moved away. The connecting door closed. The train emerged from the tunnel. Catherine opened her eyes. The display above the doors read Orpington. She sat up slowly. The platform outside was busy enough to look almost ridiculous after everything she had experienced. A railway employee carried a rubbish bag past the windows. Two teenagers stood near a vending machine. A woman argued into her phone. Catherine remained seated even after the doors opened because she no longer trusted anything that looked ordinary. Then new passengers began boarding. A man complained to his partner that the service was late. Someone asked Catherine whether the seat opposite was free. That question finally convinced her. Catherine stepped onto the platform, passed through the barriers, and walked outside. Her phone showed 12:14 a.m. According to the clock, the impossible journey had lasted only 16 minutes longer than it should have. Catherine did not sleep that night. The following morning, she searched for John Neal. At first, she found nothing, but after several hours in different combinations of his name, age, and location, she found a missing person appeal. John Neal, age 76, had been reported missing after failing to return home from a late train journey. The photograph was unmistakable. The date of his disappearance was the previous night. There was no mention of Margaret. Further searching suggested John had never married. Catherine opened the photograph he had given her. Young John still stood beside the seaside railing with one arm around empty space. She took out a notebook and wrote Margaret Neal at the top of a page. Beneath the name, Catherine recorded everything John had told her. Margaret loved crime novels, hated coriander, was a terrible cook, disliked trains, and had once told a friend that John seemed boring. Then Catherine wrote descriptions of the other passengers: the woman with the paperback, the young man in the gray hoodie, Daniel, the student with headphones, the hospital worker, the sleeping businessman. She did not know most of their names. For several weeks, Catherine avoided trains whenever possible. Then curiosity became stronger than fear. She began searching missing person archives. What she found made no sense. A newspaper report from 1997 contained a photograph of the woman with the paperback. She had disappeared after boarding an evening commuter service and had never arrived home. A missing person page from 2004 showed the young man in the gray hoodie. The hospital worker had disappeared in 2018. Daniel had been reported missing 3 years before Catherine ever met him. Catherine checked every date repeatedly. Those people had not boarded the last train together, not in the same year. Whatever Catherine had traveled on that night had somehow collected passengers from different journeys and different points in time, placing them inside the same carriage until each was taken. There was still no explanation for why Catherine could remember them when everyone else forgot. She added the dates to her notebook. 3 months later, Catherine was standing on a platform at London Bridge in the middle of the afternoon. She had resisted rail travel for as long as practical, but eventually taxis and buses became an expensive way to organize a life around fear. An ordinary routine began forcing its way back into the space the last train had occupied. A fast service approached the station. It was not scheduled to stop. Catherine stepped back from the platform edge as the train passed. Carriage after carriage blurred by. Then something made her turn her head. For less than 2 seconds, Catherine saw through one illuminated window. John Neal sat beside the glass. Margaret sat next to him. She was young, exactly as Catherine had seen her at Ashcommand. John looked directly at Catherine. He raised one hand. Catherine raised hers. Then the carriage was gone. The train disappeared into the distance. Catherine remained on the platform long after it had passed. She did not know whether John was trapped. She did not know whether Margaret had truly been restored to him, or whether the train had simply found a gentler way to keep him. She did not know whether the passengers in her notebook were dead, lost, erased, or still traveling somewhere beyond the routes marked on any railway map. She knew only that she remembered them. Inside her bag was a notebook filled with names, dates, and descriptions of people the rest of the world had already begun to forget. And on the first page, written in Catherine's own handwriting, were 2 words she refused to let disappear: Margaret Neal. Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Signal. By the time Nathan Walsh turned off the main highway, Emma had already asked twice whether he was certain the road was correct. Nathan pointed at the navigation screen and reminded his younger sister that the detour was supposed to save them almost 40 minutes on the drive back to Adelaide, although Emma remained unconvinced. She was 31, exhausted after spending an entire day at the wedding of an old university friend, and beginning to regret their decision to travel home that night instead of paying for accommodation nearby. Nathan, 3 years older and considerably more willing to drive at unreasonable hours, seemed perfectly content, while Priya Rahman had been asleep across the back seat for nearly half an hour. There was almost nothing outside except the road and the vast South Australian landscape beyond it. Their headlights revealed pale tarmac, occasional roadside markers, and low vegetation disappearing into darkness, while above them the night sky contained more stars than Emma could remember seeing in years. Nathan had spent the first part of the journey congratulating himself for finding the faster route, even though a navigation app had found it for him, and Emma had eventually turned up the radio simply to discourage further conversation. A late-night presenter was halfway through discussing a caller's disastrous first date when the broadcast disappeared. Nathan adjusted the volume, then changed stations. There was no static and no fading signal. Every station was either silent or carrying the same low electrical tone. He tried AM, then returned to FM, but the result was identical. Priya stirred in the back seat and asked what they were listening to, and when Nathan explained that every frequency had apparently died, she sat upright and listened more carefully. Beneath the continuous tone was a quieter pulse repeating at precise intervals. Priya checked the time between them and said, 11 seconds. Nathan made a joke about a transmitter fault, but Emma was already looking at her phone. She had no service, and Nathan's phone showed the same problem. The navigation map remained visible because it had been loaded earlier, although their position marker had stopped moving several kilometers behind them. Priya explained that the map itself meant nothing without an updated location, and Emma suggested turning around until Nathan pointed out that Keller's Creek was supposed to be less than half an hour ahead. They agreed that reaching a populated area made more sense than stopping on an isolated road without communications. The first strange light appeared 10 minutes later. A pale glow rose beyond the hills ahead, bright enough to turn the ridgelines into dark silhouettes. Nathan suggested a mine or industrial site, while Emma wondered whether there had been an electrical fire somewhere beyond the road. Priya considered military activity, although none of them knew of any nearby facility. The light remained visible for several seconds before disappearing completely. The radio pulse sounded. 11 seconds later, the glow returned. Priya leaned between the front seats and watched until the light faded again. The next radio pulse arrived at precisely the same interval, followed by another brightening beyond the hills. She began recording the sound on her phone, explaining that she wanted a copy in case the signal disappeared once they reached town. Emma watched another cycle and felt the first genuine discomfort of the evening, because whatever they were seeing was too regular to resemble weather and too strange to resemble any ordinary aircraft. Keller's Creek appeared shortly after midnight. The first houses looked reassuringly normal, with porch lights glowing and televisions visible through curtains. The petrol station near the center of town remained brightly illuminated, and Emma felt some of her tension ease until Nathan slowed at the next intersection. A car sat diagonally across the road with the driver's door open and the engine still running. Nathan sounded the horn, but nobody appeared. They drove around the abandoned vehicle and continued to the petrol station. The automatic doors opened as they approached, and quiet music played through ceiling speakers inside. A half-open packet of food sat behind the counter beside a mobile phone, while a microwave displayed 0 on its timer with a container still inside. Nathan checked the toilets and storage area while Emma called out, but the building was empty. The landline rang behind the counter. Nathan answered it, listened for several seconds, and slowly held the receiver away from his ear. The same low tone came through the speaker. Emma still tried to rationalize what they were seeing. A regional communications failure could explain the phones and radio, while an emergency evacuation might explain the missing cashier and abandoned car. That explanation became harder to maintain when they walked farther into town. The pub was unlocked and completely empty. A televised football replay continued above the bar. Several unfinished drinks remained on tables, and a plate of food sat beside a chair that had been pushed backwards. There was no damage, no blood, and no evidence of panic. Priya found a phone lying on one table with the camera application still open. The most recent video had been recorded less than an hour earlier. 4 people were laughing together in the recording. For the first 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then every person stopped moving at exactly the same moment. They turned towards something outside the frame, stood up, and calmly walked away. Nobody shouted or appeared frightened, and the recording continued until the abandoned phone slipped sideways against a glass. Priya suggested checking security cameras, and they returned to the petrol station. The office computer stored footage locally, allowing her to rewind to the same time. On the forecourt, a woman was filling her car, while another customer stood at the register, and two teenagers searched the drinks fridge. Then the low tone became faintly audible through the shop speakers. Everyone stopped. Each person turned towards the northwest. The woman at the fuel pump released the nozzle and walked away from her car. The cashier came around the counter. The teenagers left the refrigerator door open and followed him outside. Other cameras showed residents emerging from buildings and moving in the same direction without running or speaking. Within minutes, dozens of people had disappeared from view. Nathan noticed one person who did not join them. An elderly man wearing large industrial hearing protectors continued walking around the shop as though nothing had happened. Priya paused the video and said the hearing protection might matter. They searched the station again but found no sign of the man. Afterwards, Priya opened her laptop and examined the audio recording from the car. She had worked in live sound since university and knew enough signal processing to recognize that the 11-second pulse was only part of a much more complicated structure. Faster sequences existed inside each larger interval, layered in patterns that repeated at different scales. Nathan asked whether it was some kind of code, but Priya refused to call it that. She explained that the signal contained structure, although that did not mean it had been designed for human communication. More strangely, parts of it existed well outside the frequencies their radio should have been receiving. The audible tone might simply be the equipment reacting badly to something much broader. Nathan had become unusually quiet. Emma noticed him looking towards the northwestern edge of town and asked whether he was all right. He rubbed one ear and said there was another sound beneath the one Priya had recorded. Neither woman could hear it. Nathan struggled to describe what he meant before saying it felt almost musical and strangely familiar, like remembering something from childhood without being able to identify the memory. Emma suggested they find the police station before Nathan became more affected by whatever was happening. The building was unlocked and empty, with radios, paperwork, and coffee left where people had been using them. A communications recorder contained several recent transmissions, including one from a small aircraft that had passed over the region shortly before Keller's Creek emptied. The pilot sounded calm at first as he reported an unidentified light northwest of the town and asked whether any military activity had been authorized nearby. His next transmission was noticeably different. He said it was not a light after all, then static interrupted the recording before he returned and said, "I can't see stars behind it." Several seconds later, he added that he was underneath something. The transmission ended there. Emma followed Nathan outside and looked towards the glow beyond the hills. Priya joined them and told her not to concentrate on the light itself, but on the sky above it. The Milky Way stretched brilliantly across the outback. Except for one enormous region, there were no stars there. Emma initially thought she was seeing a cloud, but the surrounding sky was perfectly clear. The darkness extended far beyond the glow they had been watching and had edges that seemed too deliberate to belong to weather. Then the dark region changed orientation, with stars returning along one side while disappearing along another. Nathan quietly asked how large it was, and nobody attempted an answer. Priya said, "Whatever that is, it isn't ours." Emma had spent most of the night resisting impossible conclusions, but she no longer had one that fitted what she was seeing. Nathan stepped into the road and said he needed to go towards the light. Emma grabbed his arm and asked why, but he could not give her a reason. He only knew that whatever lay beyond the town suddenly felt important, and the second sound he had been hearing seemed clearer now. Priya found foam earplugs inside the police station, but they only reduced his discomfort slightly. Movement crossed the intersection behind them. Something emerged between two buildings. For several seconds, Emma tried to interpret it as machinery, because its shape resisted every familiar biological category. The entity was perhaps 3 meters tall when fully extended, although its posture constantly changed. A narrow central structure was surrounded by several jointed limbs that contacted the ground in different combinations as it moved. There was no obvious distinction between arms and legs, no visible face, and no eyes Emma could identify. The air around parts of its body seemed to distort the streetlights, causing its outline to shimmer. It crossed the road less than 20 meters away. The entity did not chase them or turn towards them. When Priya's phone emitted a brief electronic sound, one upper limb rotated towards it for an instant before the creature continued into the darkness. Nathan watched it disappear and said, "It doesn't care about us." Emma realized she would have preferred aggression. Nathan began walking northwest again, and this time Emma and Priya followed because every missing resident had gone in the same direction. If they wanted to understand what had happened, the trail was finally clear. Beyond the town, the road narrowed into a dirt track running between open grazing land. The colorless glow brightened ahead, and Emma gradually became aware of the same sensation Nathan had described. She would not have called it sound. Each pulse produced a powerful feeling that something almost understood was just beyond reach, as though her brain was repeatedly failing to complete a thought that mattered enormously. They reached the top of a low rise and stopped. Hundreds of people stood in the field below. The missing population of Keller's Creek appeared to be gathered across the grass. Children stood beside adults. People remained dressed for work or bed, and one man was barefoot. Nobody spoke. Every person faced upward. Several of the jointed entities moved among them, but they did not appear to guard the crowd. Instead, they traveled between precise points in the field, stopping at regular intervals before changing direction. Priya watched their movements and said they looked more like instruments being positioned than predators controlling prisoners. The signal pulsed again. Every resident tilted their head upward at precisely the same angle. Nathan tried to move towards them. Emma caught his wrist and told him to look at her, but he became increasingly distressed. He insisted that she did not understand and said they needed to remain there. For a few seconds, Emma felt the same certainty. Everything outside that field suddenly seemed irrelevant, while standing beneath the darkness above them felt like the only meaningful choice she had ever been offered. Priya pushed hearing protection over Emma's ears. The sensation weakened slightly. Emma finally understood that the radio had never been the source of the phenomenon. It had only converted a small portion of something much larger into audible sound. The enormous absence overhead shifted again. Stars returned where it had been and vanished across another part of the sky. Emma could no longer guess whether the object was hundreds of meters wide or many kilometers across. The entities stopped moving. The signal intensified. One of the townspeople lifted from the ground. His shoes rose only a few centimeters at first, followed by the woman beside him. Across the field, hundreds of people began to rise silently. Nathan pulled away from Emma, and Priya caught his other arm. He shouted at them to stop, sounding genuinely terrified because they were preventing him from joining the crowd. Emma almost released him when another pulse swept through her mind and filled her with the same desperate certainty. Priya shouted that they needed to leave. Together they dragged Nathan back towards Keller's Creek. An entity crossed the track ahead of them. Emma prepared to run, but the creature passed within meters of the group without changing pace or showing any interest in them. Once again, humanity seemed irrelevant to whatever process was taking place. They reached the police station and forced Nathan into a reinforced storage room beneath the building. The effect was immediate. The pressure inside Emma's head weakened, and Nathan gradually became confused rather than desperate. He remembered the empty town, but almost nothing about walking to the field. Above them, every electrical system in Keller's Creek shut down at the same moment. Then a deep vibration traveled through the ground. Dust fell from the ceiling while the concrete beneath them trembled for almost 30 seconds. There was no explosion and no impact. The vibration gradually faded, and with it disappeared the strange pressure that had been following them since the road. They remained underground until sunrise. When they returned to the surface, Keller's Creek was silent. The abandoned car remained in the intersection, while the petrol station and houses stood exactly as before. The morning sky was completely normal. They returned to the field. Nobody was there. Hundreds of residents had vanished. No bodies, vehicles, or obvious tracks explained where they had gone. Broad areas of grass had been flattened into overlapping patterns, as though tremendous pressure had been applied without anything actually landing. Communications began returning later that morning. Emergency broadcasts reported unexplained outages across a large region of South Australia, along with strange lights seen from distant roads and the loss of contact with one small aircraft. Another isolated community remained temporarily unreachable, although no report described anything resembling the disappearance of Keller's Creek. Emma, Nathan, and Priya drove back towards Adelaide. The investigation continued for months and produced no satisfying answer. Authorities documented the security recordings, unusual marks in the field, and disappearance of more than 600 people, but official language gradually transformed the impossible into phrases such as infrastructure failure, atmospheric anomaly, and unexplained mass disappearance. Nathan eventually recovered, although he never remembered standing in the field. Priya never stopped analyzing the signal. Several weeks later, she asked Emma to visit her apartment. Audio waveforms covered one computer screen, while scanned reports and old journal articles occupied another. Priya told her she had found evidence that the Keller's Creek signal was not unique. The first strong match came from 1977, when a radio observatory recorded a repeating broadband burst that appeared simultaneously across frequencies that should not have shared interference. Researchers blamed an equipment malfunction because they could not identify a source. Another possible match appeared in 1954. Communication stations in several countries reported unexplained, low-frequency pulses on the same night. Priya then showed Emma something older. An astronomical report from 1911 described a large region of stars becoming temporarily obscured despite perfectly clear weather. Observers at two different locations reported that the darkness appeared to change position without visibly crossing the intervening sky. Emma asked whether Priya believed the same thing had happened before Keller's Creek. Priya said she could not prove the events shared a single cause, although the similarities were difficult to ignore. There were other possible incidents: a communications blackout in 1989, unexplained interference recorded over the Pacific in 2003, several satellite anomalies in 2016. Most were too poorly documented to establish anything with confidence. Then Priya showed Emma the dates together. The earliest incidents were separated by decades. The gaps became shorter: 43 years, 23, 12, 7, then Keller's Creek. Emma looked at Priya and asked when the next event would happen. Priya told her there was no reliable way to predict it because the pattern was not regular enough. Emma stared at the timeline. Whatever had appeared above Keller's Creek had not necessarily arrived for humanity. The entities had shown almost no interest in people, and the signal itself had never contained any recognizable message. Perhaps they had witnessed a survey, a measurement process, or some other activity whose purpose had nothing to do with human beings. That possibility bothered Emma more than the idea of invasion. Humanity had spent generations imagining first contact as something directed towards us. Visitors would arrive to communicate, conquer, study, or destroy. Keller's Creek had felt nothing like that. Emma asked whether the earliest report Priya had found was from 1911. Priya shook her head and opened one final document. It was an astronomical journal from 1872. An observer in rural Argentina had described an enormous section of the night sky becoming completely devoid of stars for several minutes despite clear conditions. According to the translated account, the dark region appeared to alter its position without moving conventionally across the sky. Emma recognized the description immediately. There had been no radio in 1872, no mobile phones, no aircraft, no electrical grid for the phenomenon to disrupt. Whatever had happened at Keller's Creek had been happening long before humanity possessed technology capable of detecting more than the darkness overhead. Priya returned to the timeline. The intervals between the recorded events continued to shrink. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. There was no proof that every report belonged to the same phenomenon, and no way to know whether the pattern would continue. They did not know what the entities were doing, where the missing residents had gone, or whether the enormous structure had ever noticed the people beneath it. They knew only that something had been returning for generations, and each time it seemed to return a little sooner.